Imagine that your friend comes over one day and brings a Ouija board with him. You both sit and start to try to contact evil spirits, your skeptical eye watching every move the planchette makes and trying to figure out if your friend's pulling your leg. Suddenly, the planchette starts moving from the letter Z to the letter O over and over again rapidly, and after making its presence known, this spirit starts answering questions about relatives of yours with incredible accuracy. Creeped out, the next day you get curious and Google the name Zozo, only to discover thousands of similar accounts written across various message boards online. Hello and welcome to another special episode of the infographic show's greatest mysteries, the Zozo Demon. You don't have to imagine the preceding scenario because it has in fact happened to thousands of people around the world. Whether using Ouija boards, automatic writing, or various other spiritual contact techniques, people all around the world have reported contacting an entity calling itself Zozo. With the advent of the internet, people began to share their stories online, each person shocked to discover that hundreds, if not thousands of others had had the same experiences as they did. Possibly more terrifying, though, is the fact that stories about Zozo have been around for hundreds of years, with one of the oldest accounts coming from Colin de Plancy's demonic encyclopedia, the Dictionary Infernal. According to de Plancy, a young girl claimed to be constantly harassed by three evil spirits, Mimi, Crapule, and Zozo. The demons would torment the girl and force her to walk on her hands or act indecent in the company of others. Eventually, she was exorcised successfully, although the priest performing the rite was warned not to attempt another exorcism by the police. It's easy to discount old tales as mere superstition, or even to discount modern testimony as simply flights of fancy that appropriate old legends or scary stories. It's not so easy, however, to explain the massive amounts of collaborative testimony available online, especially from people surprised to discover so many others allegedly having contact with the same entity. Encounters with Zozo tend to go the same way. Contactees will be using a Ouija board or other spirit contact technique, and Zozo will make its presence known by spelling out its name. Typically, it will then answer questions that would be difficult for other people around you to know the answers to in an effort to gain your trust. Other times, it will simply start to spell out expletives. Contact with Zozo typically results in something tragic happening shortly after. One man claims that his wife left his daughter in the bathtub and stepped out for a moment, which was long enough for his daughter to begin drowning. After rescuing her, she was struck ill by a mysterious infection days later. Another woman claims that on the same day as her contact with Zozo, she was hit by a drunk driver. People differ on what exactly Zozo is, but whatever it is, it's clearly got a bad temper. Some say that Zozo is a demon, possibly even the ancient Mesopotamian king of wind demons, Pazuzu. Others believe Zozo is simply a malevolent entity that appropriated the name because of growing fear around it. Yet others believe that Zozo is not a single entity, but rather a name that various evil or mischievous spirits use to scare us, knowing how scared we've become of contacting the ill-tempered Zozo. These people think that spirits may simply be having a bit of fun with us by using the name, while more evil spirits appropriate it in order to scare us, and fear, they believe, gives the spirits power. Whatever its origin, some of Zozo's characteristics involve an attraction to the female sex, preferring contact with women over men. Zozo also seems to be attracted to people with suicidal tendencies, depression, or other psychological disorders. Researchers claim that these people are more vulnerable to demonic influence, giving a demon more power over them and making it easier to push them to do extreme things such as suicide or hurting or scaring others. Those who claim to have come in contact with Zozo describe sudden and intense feelings of anger, fear, depression, or generally black thoughts as they talk with Zozo. Their encounters are typically followed by seemingly bad luck. Others, though, are more severely affected, with some claiming to have suffered physical symptoms such as headaches, sleepwalking, and the appearance of marks and bruises on their body. This is all quite terrifying if true. Along with a host of believers, there are just as many skeptics, however, and the preferred tool of contact with Zozo, the Ouija board, itself is fraught with doubts. For starters, it's a game manufactured by a major toy company, and many skeptics have a hard time swallowing the fact that spirits and demons are immediately accessible with a simple board game. There may be some merit to that point, but then again, if the world of spirits and demons is real, then who says they need some special archaic and mysterious method to contact us? But that's hardly the only criticism leveled at the Ouija board. In 1972, psychologists ran an experiment to see if people could have paranormal spirit contact experiences through nothing more than human will. Basically, they wanted to see if it was all just in our heads. For the study, they made up a fictional person named Philip Aylesford and then invited a group of people to run a seance in order to summon his ghost. The group eventually made contact with the entity, becoming convinced that they could feel Philip's presence, hearing knocking sounds coming from the table, felt the table physically vibrate, and at one point saw the table tilt up onto two legs. All the while, they had no idea that Philip had been completely made up. The story proved just how susceptible we can be to believing in the paranormal with just the smallest amount of prodding. Yet, if the world of spirits and demons is real, what's to say that a mischievous spirit or evil demon didn't simply respond to the seance, knowing full well what was taking place, and reveling in the frustration the entire affair would cause when the participants were told there was no such person as the one they claimed to be speaking to? Why would spirits and demons be any different than we are? Basically, why wouldn't a spirit troll a scientific study way back in 1972? Other skeptics point at the ideomotor effect as an explanation for contact with Zozo and other paranormal entities. The ideomotor effect is the subconscious and involuntary movement of muscles, typically to a very small and likely imperceptible degree. This effect has been well documented, most famously by the famed Michael Faraday, who built a device to show how the ideomotor effect was responsible for the table-turning fad that swept supernatural-believing London. Today, skeptics claim that Ouija board communications are nothing more than the subconscious mind using the ideomotor effect to push the planchette around and give us the answers we're seeking. Zozo may well be simply a product of our own subconscious pushing a planchette on a Ouija board with movements so imperceptible that even we ourselves are fooled into believing a supernatural explanation. Yet that doesn't explain the global internet phenomenon, which has seen thousands of people all claiming contact with the exact same entity. Skeptics point out the possibility of a mass psychological trend amongst all these believers, or that potentially every single one of them is simply making up a tall tale. Both answers could be true, but with just as much hard evidence for either of those two answers as there is for Zozo, that being zero. There's a special kind of irony that the belief Zozo is not real requires just as much factless faith as the belief that it is. Let's imagine you have a big fight coming up and you want to make sure you win. Perhaps the last thing you'd think about is summoning a demon or some kind of spirit to get your victory. Or perhaps you want to ensure a certain person you're attracted to feels the same way about you. Would you consider using magic to guarantee their devotion? The answer is very likely no, for the fight and for the attraction. But some people have tried this, and their term for the summoning is usually called an evocation. Such practices were of course more in vogue in the past, but there are still people that dabble in the dark arts today. Let's now see how it's done. We'll start with the summoning a demon you might very well have heard of because you watched the movie Hereditary. The demon is called Paimon, and since he has endless knowledge, getting him on your side could work out well for you. The thing is, as you might have seen in that movie, a few sacrifices might have to be made. The experts, by the way, said the movie was over the top and Paimon would never expect headless humans as sacrifice. He's not that hardcore, and maybe a bit of blood will suffice. So one way to get down with Paimon, or at least try, is to draw a large circle on the ground. It will be big enough for you, the spellcaster, to stand in, as well as the demon if he should choose to show up. You'll then place candles in the cardinal directions, meaning north, south, east, and west. These represent the demon Belial to the north, Lucifer to the east, Flurius to the south, and Leviathan to the west. These guys represent all the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. Once you've got this all set up, you'll then try and evoke the main man, Satan, to put all the elements in a state of pure balance. Here's the prayer you can use to summon Satan. Lord Satan, by your grace, grant me, I pray, the power to conceive in my mind and to execute that which I desire to do, the end which I would attain by thy help, O mighty Satan, the one true God who livest and reignest forever and ever. I entreat thee to inspire Paimon to manifest before me, that they may give me true and faithful answer, so that I may accomplish my desired end, provided that it is proper for his or her office. This I respectfully and humbly ask in your name, Lord Satan. May you deem me worthy, Father. After this, you can then summon Paimon. You could do this in a group, which might be a little less scary. Just get your friends together and join hands around the circle. You can try summoning Paimon and he may communicate with someone in that circle. Apparently, if he does attempt to communicate, the noise will be too much for that person whose head he has entered, so you can request that he lower the volume. He is said to have a very loud voice and also comes down to earth with crashing cymbals. If he doesn't come, there's also the option to prick your finger a little bit and drop some blood into the flames of the candles, because hey, demons often like a bit of sacrifice. You might think this is all very outlandish and hasn't been done before, but that's not true. You can find ways to summon demons like Paimon in a series of old magical books called the Grimoires. One expert on these books said Paimon is a particularly hard demon to summon only because he's one of 4 kings of hell. He talks about navigating the bureaucracies of hell, meaning to get Paimon you might have to go through lesser demons first. But there are lots of demons you can try and summon, and there's no reason to just go for Paimon. We looked at other ways to get your demon into your world and found that some people will start by drawing a pentagram on the floor. After that, get yourself 5 candles of the same color and a color you think is befitting for your demon of choice. Place each candle at every point in the pentagram. These points represent earth, air, water, fire, and spirit. You'll then have to print out the sigil of your demon. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of like the pictorial signature of your demon. It's your demon symbol, a demonic icon. You'll have to memorize this sigil so you can bring it into your thoughts when you choose to do so. As you stand in that pentagram, you'll have this sigil in your mind when you read out aloud the prayer we told you about earlier. If something does make contact with you, it's important to show the utmost respect. For example, if you're summoning Paimon, make sure to call him King Paimon. You should also get to know them and not just start making demands. We actually found someone online that said she'd been in contact with Paimon a few times, and she said he was polite and harmless. She said she asked him a lot of things, including this. One of the first things I asked King Paimon for was to convince my dad to let me build my home on his land, because if I have to pay for land on top of the house building costs, it'll take 20 years, and I don't have time for that. She used the pentagram, the candles, the sigil, and the prayer. You could use this same method to summon a demon called Andromalius. For those who work in dark circles, this demon can offer protection from someone who wishes to do them harm. It's also said he can return things to you that have been stolen. One woman we found online made a small doll of the person that had done something bad and filled it with really disgusting things. It seems more people summon demons than we generally assume. And one forum we found had a thread dedicated to summoning Andromalius. One person wrote that he had done this and the demon had come, adding, "He sorted out a major issue for me in under a month. This is how he did it. He got the sigil of the demon as well as red candles and an indigo candle. He also put together some raw eggs, some rose wine, some blood, some cakes, and some fresh strawberries. He then wrote out what he wanted from the demon and made sure he had some photos of the person that had done wrong to him. He put those photos under the candles. When all that was in order, after midnight each night he would chant the Andromalius N, which is kind of a prayer but in a language we couldn't understand. You can find this N on YouTube. It goes something like this: Tassa Fubin Andromalius Onkar. You have to keep repeating that and all the time have this sigil in your mind. You can even print out the sigil and drop a bit of blood on it. When he comes, you'll likely hear some hissing, and he usually arrives with a snake. You can then tell him again what it is you want, which in this case will usually be protection or to get something stolen from you back. Another person we found did this to get back at someone who had done bad to them, but they had carved the name of that person into the candles. They also rolled the candles in castor oil and then covered them in black pepper and basil. Some people, well, some men, might want to summon a female demon. What we're talking about is a succubus, the female demon that gets into a man's head at night and makes love to them. Can one of these actually be summoned? Apparently, to get her to come visit you, first you have to set the mood, which means planting around the bedroom a few candles and incense sticks. One person then did this. He got himself some white chalk, with which he said he drew a circle on the floor, although a pentagram would have done. That circle must remain clear of clutter, and you can't even let it get a bit dusty. He then laid crushed herbs around the circle for what he called protection. On the inside of the circle, at even distances, he put down 5 black candles, and at the same points but on the outside of the circle, he placed 5 sigils. When he was ready and the candles were lit, he laid in the circle with his arms and legs spread out in the shape of a pentagram. He then imagined the succubus coming. One person imagined his succubus to be a woman he actually knew and then chanted this prayer: O Lilith, send your servant after me only for good reasons and not to harm thee. I call to be with my desire, my own passion to fill my dire heart. I imagine the woman I want, and therefore she shall be a succubi. According to that person, this can get you the woman of your dreams. For women, if they want a man, they can summon an incubus. We're told that this relationship should be formed slowly because these are powerful demons. Perhaps on the first night, just get to know each other rather than jump right in. If you want to see what the demon looks like, we're told you can use a black mirror to do something called scry. Scrying is sometimes called seeing into the future, but in this case, it's just to get a glimpse of who you're talking to. You place the black mirror in front of you and put lit candles in the middle, and then you look at the mirror through the flame. Some people say that the candle you use should be inscribed with the qualities of the person you're looking for. You have to know what exactly you want, and that way, you'll get the demon you want. In all, it seems there are plenty of ways to summon a demon, and mostly they include knowing the demon and getting his sigil, getting the right candles, maybe offering some blood, and setting the scene. We should say that some people don't believe in drawing circles or pentagrams. You should also either use the demon prayer or try to find the demon's end. Know what you want to ask, and always be polite. But there are other ways people have tried to summon demons, and we're sure some of you might have used a Ouija board at some point in your life. Kids have also tried playing a summoning game called the Charlie Charlie Challenge, which involves trying to summon a demon using pencils and paper. They ask, "Are you there?" And if the pencil hits the yes on the paper, then the evocation has succeeded. We might add that for people who take their summoning seriously, such basic evocations might be a little insulting. It was June 6th of 2013 when an old Bavarian home went up in flames. Someone claimed that they could see the outline of a person in the smoke. Could this be the spirit of a young girl from nearly 40 years ago? A girl who many believed was possessed by up to 7 demons and who both lived and died in the same building. Let's look at what once took place in the now destroyed property in this episode of the infographic show, The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel. Anneliese Michel was born in West Germany in September of 1952 to a middle-class family who lived in a white house with green window frames. She had 3 younger siblings, all girls. Her parents were Roman Catholics and she was raised religiously, attending Mass each and every week. However, her seemingly normal, albeit strict upbringing veered off course when she turned 16. This was when she had a sudden and debilitating seizure and was diagnosed as having temporal lobe epilepsy, or TLE. The condition causes seizures that last between 1 and 2 minutes. It's possible for those diagnosed with this disorder to remain fully conscious. They'll have hallucinations of the senses, visual distortions, dissociation, déjà vu, amnesia, anxiety, and other strong emotions. The seizure may end there or progress to an impaired awareness type in which consciousness is affected. This may cause individuals to stare unmoving, move reflexively, or be unable to speak, read, or understand words. They may also feel confused or struggle with communication. This seizure may even spread further to become a generalized type where the whole body will tense up and jerk. After seizing, someone may be disoriented for a span of minutes to days. Clearly, the condition can be life-changing. The good news for Anneliese is that though she had more than one, she still didn't have very many. Though the few she had in combination with other problems were enough to destroy her very well-being. It was June of 1970 when she had her third. At the time, she was a patient in a psychiatric hospital and was given an anticonvulsant medication to help her with her symptoms. However, these didn't seem to work. In fact, her situation became worse. She started to hallucinate and see the faces of demons. Further, she would believe that she was smelling fire or feces that weren't really there, as well as develop paralysis of both arms. Based on this, the doctors added the drug Owlept to her anti-seizure medication. This was typically effective for cases of schizophrenia and other forms of delusions. As many with TLE do, she became depressed. She started to hear voices as well while she was praying. These would taunt her and say she was damned and destined for hell. Despite the doctor's best efforts, by 1973, her mental health only continued to grow worse. She also became more and more depressed. After years of medications and treatments and without any improvements, she considered an alternate prognosis that required an entirely different form of intervention. She believed that she was possessed by demons and could only be saved through exorcism. The reason she believed she was possessed was because her mother had had a child before marriage, and so the curse for her infidelity had been passed on to her. The illegitimate child was seemingly cursed too, as she died while undergoing surgery in 1956. Others supported this idea. A family friend was convinced of Annalise's possession once she visited her and displayed oddly religiously intolerant behavior. This included the refusal to walk by a crucifix or drink any holy water from a spring. In fact, she couldn't even enter the shrine that the spring was in, as she had the sensation that the ground was burning under her feet. Those praying also looked to her as if they were frantically gnashing their teeth, and the pictures of the Holy Trinity sparkled blindingly. These symptoms convinced many beyond her family that there really was an evil spirit in her. Her parents began to contact priests in hopes of saving her with an exorcism. At first, their requests were met with refusal and the suggestion of seeking only medical forms of treatment. Further, the priests explained that such rites required the bishop's approval. This would only be granted in the case of several specific circumstances. In other words, certain conditions would have to be met that helped determine whether or not an individual was truly possessed before any action could be taken. The Catholic Church's terms for possession was infestation, and some of its documented first signs included feelings of repulsion for religious or supernatural artifacts. Clearly, as far as this, Annalise fit the bill. However, she was still not given the exorcism that she wanted so badly. Instead, she developed several further unusual behaviors. She began to act violently and bite her family, and also hurt herself. Further, she started to consume her own urine, as well as flies, spiders, and coal. Rumors are that she even bit off and swallowed the head of a bird and went under a table and barked for days. Not very surprisingly, considering what she ate, she would have periods of diarrhea and vomiting. She believed that all of this was due to her past wrongs and began sleeping on the hard stone floor as a self-imposed punishment. Her situation was becoming quite desperate. In late 1973, she began the medication Tegretol, meant to stabilize her emotions as well as prevent her seizures. Like before with the other drugs, it did little to help. Ernst Alt, a pastor, ended up contacting Bishop Josef Stangl on Annalise's behalf in support of an exorcism. His support was based upon his observations of her, in which he concluded that she didn't seem like an epileptic and had never, as far as he'd noticed, had a seizure. Instead, he believed her symptoms were due to the work of demons. Finally, in 1975, the bishop gave his approval to the Michels family's third request for an exorcism. The procedure was to be performed by priest Arnold Renz, and he was to do it in complete secrecy. The first session took place in September of 1975. 66 further sessions would follow, up to twice weekly for 4 hours each, and over the span of around 10 months. These would consist of Father Renz and Pastor Alt moving crucifixes back and forth, burning incense, and chanting prayers. Then Annalise would scream for hours in unreal and primal sounds. It seemed to be working when the many demons within her vanished except for one. Until the next day, when the rest returned. Somehow, they didn't give up. In fact, Annalise asked her family to discontinue looking to doctors for medical treatments in favor of relying only on exorcism. They followed her wishes. Eventually, as her treatments went on, Annalise stopped eating or drinking. She said that the demons would not let her. According to some sources, Annalise eventually requested the exorcism to end. She claimed that the Virgin Mary had come to her in a vision and asked her to stay possessed to benefit mankind and to become a martyr. She obeyed. Quite eerily, she apparently knew the day she was going to die and accurately predicted it beforehand. She died on the 1st of July, 1976. The official cause of death given was malnutrition and dehydration. It was determined that she had been in a state of starvation for almost a year. In fact, her corpse weighed only 68 pounds or 30 kilograms. Not long before, she had become so weak that she could no longer move on her own, and the motions required for her exorcism had shattered both of her knees. She may also have been suffering from pneumonia. She told her exorcist to beg for absolution, and her mother that she was afraid. Those were the last words she would say. She was only 23 when she died. Her parents and the priests involved were prosecuted and accused of negligent homicide upon her passing. It was suggested that an intervention could have saved her life at any point up until days before she ultimately died, such as through force feeding. Doctors gave testimony that Annalise was not possessed, but her symptoms were only because of her epileptic episodes mixed with her religious beliefs. Some experts suggested that she had a very severe case of schizophrenia. However, it was revealed that at least one such doctor had told Annalise that there was no type of medicine that could fight the devil, destroying his credibility. As proof of her possession, tapes were played in court of the exorcism sessions, in which Annalise spoke in different voices as if demons were arguing. These evil spirits claimed to be Nero, Hitler, Judas Iscariot, Cain, and Lucifer. In other words, her body was not just possessed by one demon, but many, and at certain times this was up to 7. She would also speak in various languages, such as Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Ultimately, those directly involved believed that the exorcism had been successful, as these strange voices ended right before her death. Whether or not this was true, lawyers argued for freedom of religion and against any sentencing. However, the stakes were not as high as they could have been. The state pushed for fining the priests, and the prosecution believed that the parents had suffered enough already. Therefore, no parties faced jail time for what they had done. They were originally convicted of manslaughter due to negligence and given a 6-month jail sentence. However, this was suspended. They ended up with only 3 years probation, which was a greater sentence than the prosecution had asked for, but was far from the worst punishment possible. After it was over, the body of Annalise was exhumed at the request of her parents. She was then placed in a better coffin. However, that was not the real reason her parents wanted access to her body. It turns out, a nun from Bavaria had a vision and afterwards contacted Annalise's parents to share it with them. She had supposedly seen their daughter's remains unchanged and perfectly preserved in her coffin. They had hoped that this was actually true and that it would show that she was really possessed and ultimately saved through exorcism. Her body, however, as any other body would do, had begun to decompose with time. Despite this finding, interest in her case continued. Her grave even became a revered site where many visited on a pilgrimage. Then the buses came, stuffed door to door with tourists who were eager to see where Annalise had lived, her grave, and the chapel erected in her memory. These people who had a fascination with the case came by in droves and quite overwhelmed the small Bavarian city. The church was dealt a blow through the negative publicity. It did eventually have a change of opinion and state that she was likely mentally ill and not possessed, but damage had already been done. The rate of exorcisms declined. This likely won't change anytime soon. As recently as 1999, the new pope made the rules governing exorcisms tougher and approval much harder to get. But were they ultimately right, or were they wrong after all? It may just be a coincidence, but in May of 2013, the garage of the chapel built for Annalise burnt down. While a faulty light was found nearby, a police spokesman later claimed that that would be a very odd and atypical way to start a fire. Then, 3 weeks later, the home in which she both lived and died was engulfed in flames. Fortunately, it was empty and had been since her family no longer lived there. Rather unsurprisingly, no one else wanted to move in. While some think demons are to blame, the mayor of the town claimed that it was arson committed by teenagers. If it was the work of children, all we can say is that they picked quite a day to burn down the home. June is the 6th month of the year. That Thursday was the 6th day in the month, and the sum of the digits in the year 2013 give you a 6. That's 3 6s, or 666, the biblical sign of the devil. Is it just another coincidence, or is it really an indication that what others feared could be true really was all along? You might not be religious, but you've likely had to deal with a fair bit of Satan in your life. The pesky devil has shown up on the shoulders of cartoon characters, acting as a counterweight to a good decision that appears as an angel on the other shoulder. He starred in numerous movies, getting into the minds of innocent girls that had to undergo excruciating exorcisms, and he's been depicted in art form as living in a fiery underworld where wrongdoers spend eternity wishing they hadn't stolen that everlasting gobstopper when they were just 8 years old. On a more serious note, back in the day, if you were accused of being in league with this guy, you were likely going to suffer greatly. What most of you don't know is where Satan comes from, so that's what we'll discuss in this episode of the Infographic Show, the origin of Satan. First of all, why do we often use the word Satan as another word for devil? Well, it's complicated, but a devil, which is really a manifestation of evil, is what you could call the darker side of humanity. You might say the devil is chaos, or dark for our light, the dualistic wrong for our right, and this is not something that only the Christian religion came up with. After all, people have lived in brutal times, whether experiencing famine, war, disease, or just horrific toil, needed a reason why there could be good in the world and also horror. Devils and dark spirits run through most of religions and beliefs. Satan is just one devil character, although we refer to Satan as the devil. That's just because you've been brought up as Christian or around Christianity. Mr. Satan, aka the Prince of Darkness, comes from what we call the Abrahamic religions, which are monotheistic or one-God religions, which include the big three: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We can trace Satan back to the Old Testament, and he first appeared as a subordinate to God or Yahweh. This devil wasn't equal in power to God, but the entity did mess with God. Abner Weiss, a psychologist and the rabbi at Westwood Village Synagogue in Los Angeles, told Live Science that indeed people wanted a reason for why there was so much pain in the world. They needed a villain, and so one emerged. They hypothesized a kind of demonic divine force that was responsible for evil, arising out of the notion that a good God could not be responsible for bad things, he said. And so the Old Testament included some of these bad characters, possibly usurpers of God's power, who were intent on creating chaos down below where occasionally nothing grew and animals got sick. We had such a character in the book of Job. Job starts off living the life wryly. He has wealth and a happy family. Then Satan, known as the accuser, asks God if he thinks Job would be so pious even if he had his happy life stripped from him. This accuser says that if Job suddenly found himself a down and out with nothing, he would retract his belief in God. God, of course, likes a good challenge, and he tells the accuser to take away Job's happiness, kill his children, his servants, and even cover him with boils. Job, left with nothing, muses, "Shall we receive good from God and shall we not receive evil?" This is the beginning of the great dichotomy of good and evil. Perhaps this evil was there to test us. We won't go through an entire book of Job, but you get the picture. A kind of Satan existed in the Old Testament, a dark for all the light, but the dark was certainly no match for the light. The story of Satan being a fallen angel isn't in the New Testament. We get this story from the ancient Jewish book of Enoch. In this tract, 200 angels are given the task of watching over humans. They're known as the Watchers. They don't do a very good job and end up sleeping with human women, while spreading around sin on earth. They end up being forsaken by God and living in dark caves. In the Jewish book of Jubilees, you have Mastema, who is thought to be a Satan character, but again, he's more of a tempter than he is outright evil. He becomes a tester of humans, and he gets the thumbs up from God to do this. Mastema also enlists some of those fallen angels to do his work. There are many interpretations, but let's just say this guy was a tempter of humans more than an adversary of God. Then you have the second book of Enoch. Enoch was a descendant of Noah from the thriller story about a flood with a giant animal-carrying ark. In that book, you have a character called Sataniel, who is also one of those fallen angels. However, in the New Testament, this terrible fall of angels just goes missing. There are lots more instances of Satan-like characters in the ancient texts, but we must move on and meet a more modern kind of devil. And so came Satan as we know him. As depicted in the New Testament, a Satan character appears in the story of Matthew, wherein he tries to tempt Jesus away from his devotion to God. It's similar to the Satan in the book of Job, as the devil is up to his old tricks again and questioning piousness. But this is far from being a pitchfork-wielding entity who gets on the nerves of holy men. The newer dichotomy presents this evil character again as a tempter, although theologians tell us that this new character wasn't a kind of aid to God that was on God's payroll to tempt people away from the Almighty. The devil now becomes a kind of opposite to God, a yin for the yang, because if there was good in the world, God created it, and if there was bad, which there certainly is, then it must have been the work of something else. Perhaps even, unlike the Old Testament, something with almost as much power as God. One religious scholar tells us that this character is often said to have been one of those fallen angels, although this is not clear. You have to remember we're talking about many books written by many people over a very long period of time. This is why studying religious texts takes up so much time and still people disagree. You also have the story of the devil we call Lucifer, which for some is just another Satan. Lucifer, sometimes interchangeable as Satan, rebelled against God and with other fallen angels waged war against God. You also have Beelzebub, a flying demon who might also be Satan in one form or another. Yes, it's confusing, but let's just understand that at least in the Christian religion, we have a lot of dark characters appear that are adversaries of God or of godness. These characters appear in other religions, as we said, but today we're talking about the Satan most of us know from early morning evangelist television or even those cartoons and movies we mentioned earlier. This tempter could also have been the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who tempts Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and so start a lifetime of woe for the rest of us that followed. For their sin, the fledgling couple were banished from the garden. Not only is the existence of such a couple highly dubious in the name of science, but scholars of religion have different takes on the tale. Nonetheless, we have a serpent who could be said to be Satan, despite the serpent never explicitly being called that. Then of course you have this tempter working to put Jesus Christ on the wrong track, but he wasn't as successful as he was in the Garden of Eden. You also have the Great Red Dragon, which appeared in the Book of Revelations, which also goes toe-to-toe with God. But how did all this turn into a guy with a pitchfork or a girl with a head that can spin 360 degrees? Well, the belief in an evil force didn't ever go out of fashion, as did an adversary of good and God. You could say that we just melted all the ancient stories of evil and put one face to them, but a face that could embody lots of other entities. Throughout history, enemies could be said to embody this evil force as anyone who went against the state or its prescribed religion. We've all seen politicians talk about God and then bomb people apparently not on the good side. To some extent, the opposing side is supposed to be Satan. Even in these times, people with mental problems were often said to have been overtaken by this evil force, so we certainly stretched the devil as far as we could. While women became naturally lustful, perhaps they could have been said to have been a victim of evil. In the Middle Ages, Satan was active in the minds of people, but his story didn't have all that much power. In the 15th century, Satan got some feet with all these witchcraft trials that happened, and now this tempter of the past was someone who could verily live down your street. In 1611, we got the English-language King James Bible, which had Lucifer as a starring figure, literally as he was the morning star. Satan was depicted as having cloven hooves, which was related to the Greek god Pan, an erotic kind of god. We had works such as the Divine Comedy and Paradise Lost. In Dante's Divine Comedy, we have descriptions of hell as an inferno. Then descriptions of purgatory and also paradise. We started getting very creative with Satan and what was an evil nebulous force from the past starting to take on a form that we could look at and fear. In the 16th century, we had depictions of the devil by great artists such as Agostino Musi's The Skeletons or Cornelius Galli I's Lucifer. The latter shows the devil as a horned monster with wings busily eating men. A lot more devil paintings would arrive, but the artists had nothing to go on really. They were just being creative and relying on this story of a fallen, warring angel rather than an entity that in times past did his best tempting at the behest of God. All said, we started creating a very scary-looking devil, one that didn't look that much different from ourselves, albeit if we were part beast. So while the books of the Bible didn't explicitly describe hell with a Satan figure with wings and two horns that carries a pitchfork around, we got creative with the story. He doesn't always carry a pitchfork, and it's said that his depiction comes from the Greek god Poseidon. In medieval art, he took on many forms, and later we started portraying the devil to look almost like us, sometimes being able to embody us. To conclude, this thing we call Satan is a mishmash of many different ancient stories. We've also put our own spin on Satan over many hundreds of years. He's almost always been a tempter of humans to go to the dark side. But in later periods, that didn't just mean believing in God, but perhaps lying, cheating, stealing, or even dancing too hard like in the movie Footloose. He changed from being not just the reason why floods and famines or wars happen, but also a kind of boogeyman that inhabits the mind of non-believers. Many Christians don't believe in heaven and hell or the devil, but might talk about the better angels of our nature and being led astray by our self-destructive vices. To some, he's a metaphor, not an actual entity. The devil, after all, might be best depicted for some as that cartoon character that sits on the shoulders of another character who's about to do something bad or turn away from the bad deed. There are, of course, many others who believe in a great reckoning when God beams the good guys to heaven and the rotten ones are left below to their vices. We also see the devil in some depictions of a necessary evil, artistic chaos for a reason, as British artist and poet William Blake depicted. After all, surely bad needs to exist for good to flourish, and surely cold, stern order comes out of scary, creative chaos. But that's another story. In the blue corner is the Being Supreme, the Lord of Love and the reigning world champion in the infinite battle of good versus evil, the one and only God Almighty. In the red corner is Heaven's outcast, the devil from down below, and the one and only master of deception and father of lies, the Prince of Darkness. That's pretty much how the story goes, or at least that's the tale many people tell. But Satan, he's a complicated entity. There's much more to him than most people know. He's not just a devil with a pitchfork who stands on your shoulder telling you to steal a candy bar. He has a long history and he's gotten up to stuff you wouldn't believe. Today we're going to learn a lot more about this overlord of the underworld. Number 50. Okay, so first you need to know who Satan is. It's a bit more complicated than you think, but we'll try and make this one as short as we can. There's a kind of devil in all the Abrahamic religions, but in Christianity, he plays a bigger role than he does in Judaism or Islam. In all three religions, Satan is there to make people impure, to lure them to the dark side. The Old Testament talks about an entity that is an adversary of God. He's there in the book of Job, making life really hard for Job. He kills Job's children, his servants, and for good measure, he covers Job in boils. He does all this to see if Job will renounce his belief in God. So there you go, Satan is there to mess with people's beliefs. Still, in that old book, he's far from being a cloven-hooved beast with horns that can spin a young girl's head around. In the New Testament, there's talk of fallen angels. In the story of Matthew, there's a devil-type thing that tries to persuade Jesus to give up his belief in God. He's yet again the tempter, the evil to all the good in the world. In short, there are lots of stories. There's Lucifer, sometimes interchangeable as Satan, who is said to have rebelled against God, and with a gang of other fallen angels, they wage a war against God. Then you have Beelzebub, a flying demon who's also a kind of Satan character. And in the book of Revelations, you have the red serpent, which you could call devilish. But what about the pitchfork-swinging, constantly cursing guy who isn't very photogenic? Well, he was made up by some creative folks in the Middle Ages. Dante Alighieri wrote about Satan in the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century. This is how Satan is described in the Inferno part. He has 3 faces, he has a chest of ice, he has mighty bat-like wings, crunching teeth, and he's generally a rotten thing. While the King James Bible became a bestseller after it was published in 1611, Lucifer, aka the Morning Star, played a big part, as it did in John Milton's 1667 masterpiece Paradise Lost. Now we have a much more wicked tempter, a more monstrous figure who's a real brute. Satan was no longer just an angel that had switched jobs, he was something more terrifying. The cloven hooves and horns were often a feature which relates back to Pan, a mythological half-goat, half-man figure that was always wild and irrepressibly horny. When you think about famine, plague, and the rest of the crappy things that made Europe a horrible home for a long time, it only makes sense that this devil turned into something absolutely terrifying. This is the guy evangelists conjure up in their nightmares. He's the entity that possessed witches and made Hollywood tons of money. The bottom line is the devil evolved throughout history. Okay, we had to get that out of the way. Now for some short facts. Number 49. Not surprisingly, when you go filling people's heads with stories of this beast, it affects some folks in a bad way. In 2018, an Australian man beat his best friend to death because he thought his friend was Satan. Satanic serial killer Richard Ramirez once shouted at a victim, "Swear on Satan." This one survived, many did not. In fact, a lot of killers have claimed to either be in the service of Satan or believe they're killing Satan. Either way, most people would believe Satan isn't to blame. As you'll see in the show, the devil is often a scapegoat. Well, that's what the law thinks. Number 48. A 2016 Gallup poll revealed 79% of the American respondents said they believed in God, but only 61% of the people said they believed in the devil. Number 47. A similar poll went out in the UK, but only 18% of the people said they believed in the devil. Number 46. US televangelist Paul Crouch once said that if you play a part of Led Zeppelin's song Stairway to Heaven backwards, there is a satanic message in there. This is how it allegedly goes. Here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He will give you those with him 666. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer, sad Satan. Guitarist Jimmy Page once said it was hard enough to write the song forwards, never mind backward too. By the way, some experts now say the number in the Bible that represents the number of the beast is 616. Number 45. There's a Church of Satan, but its founders don't actually believe Satan or God, for that matter, exists. One of the high priests said believers are insane, and he says Satan just represents someone who is an adversary or an opposer, someone who questions everything. Recently, a British member of the Church of Satan said Satanism has less to do with doing bad things than it does with being an atheist and a libertarian. In the US, you can pay $225 and get a lifetime membership for the Church of Satan. Number 44. Some people believe if Jesus is the Son of God, then the Antichrist is the son of Satan. An example would be Damien Thorne in the Omen movies. Number 43. It's been said that the first of those Omen movies was cursed, with the reason being a lot of really unlucky things happened to the cast and crew. The weirdest of all of them involved effects artist John Richardson. He was the guy responsible for creating the famous decapitation scene in the movie. During the filming of his next movie, he got into a car crash. He survived, but his passenger was decapitated. On top of that, an animal trainer was killed by a tiger after making The Omen, and during the filming of The Omen, a stuntman was attacked by trained Rottweilers. Number 42. The Pope has been accused of being the Antichrist from time to time. Martin Luther once said the Pope is the true end times Antichrist who has raised himself over and set himself against Christ. Number 41. Quite a few American presidents have at one point been accused of being the Antichrist. Those include Donald Trump, Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. Hillary Clinton has been called out too. Number 40. Okay, so some people think the mark of the beast will appear on us all at some point. It comes from something written in the book of Revelations. It goes like this. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. What could that mean? Maybe subcutaneous technology could be the mark of the beast. In the past, people used to say the number was 666, hidden in barcodes. That's been debunked, but people have now moved on to microchips under the skin. Some evangelicals have already said those chips will be the mark of the beast that gets under everyone's skin. Number 39. Quite a few well-known people have said the Freemasons worship the devil. We don't have any proof to back that up. Now we'll talk about some really dark things the devil has supposedly been involved with. Number 38. According to the Canon Episcopi, a text of medieval canon law dating back to the 10th century, witchcraft was alive and well in Europe back then. It says witches flew around on broomsticks, and one of their favorite destinations was the forest. The forest is where they made love to demons and sometimes killed infants in the name of Satan. Number 37. Things got much more heated in the 15th century. That was when the book Malleus Maleficarum was written, a treatise on witches that detailed the exploits of people possessed by Satan. It might sound funny to you, but it led to massive persecution of people accused of being witches. Thousands of people were tortured and killed during decades of witch hunts. Number 36. The first European folks to make the New World their home weren't much better. The Puritans of New England talked about babies being born with claws and horns, which was a sure sign the devil had infiltrated the woman. Some of those Puritans believed the Native Americans were children of the devil. Number 35. It was mostly thanks to the Enlightenment thinkers in the 17th and 18th centuries that belief in witchcraft started to die. Unfortunately, some parts of Europe and the New World remained in the dark and dismissed what those thinkers said. Witch hunts stopped in most places, but belief in Satan remained strong. Number 34. Satan doesn't just appear in Christian Bibles, he also shows up in the Talmud and has been discussed by Jewish rabbis at length, with some positing that Satan was involved in the story of Moses returning from Mount Sinai, and that he might have played a role in the Purim story, which tells of how the Jews were saved from the Persian Empire. Number 33. And speaking of the Talmud, the origin of the name Satan actually comes from the Hebrew word ha-satan, which means opposer or adversary, and was used in the Hebrew Bible as a term for both human enemies of the Jewish people as well as supernatural forces. Number 32. In 1966, after the Beatles member John Lennon said his band was more popular than Jesus, people in the southern United States took to burning Beatles records even if they loved them. Some people believe Lennon made a pact with the devil so he could get famous. The devil got his due though because Lennon was shot dead in the street. Number 31. In the 1960s, the Beatles were accused of putting satanic messages in their music. Decades later, an article in the Vatican newspaper praised the band for their melodic tunes. Now something that might frighten you. Number 30. In 2018, The Atlantic reported that priests in the US were being asked to perform an unusual number of exorcisms. The article said the official exorcist for Indianapolis has received 1,700 requests so far in 2018. That's a lot for just one state, especially as there are only around 100 official Catholic exorcists in the US. Number 29. In 2020 in Panama, 7 people died in a mass exorcism. The victims included a pregnant woman and her 5 young kids. An extremist religious group was blamed for the deaths when it was discovered members of the groups held natives captive and beat them with Bibles, burned them with torches, and cut them with machetes. This particular sect was denounced as satanic by local church authorities. Number 28. The novel The Exorcist was partly based on the alleged demonic possession of a 14-year-old American kid known as Roland Doe. That wasn't his real name. The exorcism was kinda like in the movie, in that the boy allegedly spoke in a weird voice, things flew on their own around the room, and the kid couldn't stand to be near a holy cross. At one point, marks just appeared on the kid's body. It's also said he got up and broke a priest's nose. Number 27. In 2014, 2 women in the US were charged with murder after killing 2 children aged 1 and 2 during an exorcism. The women said the kids' eyes had turned black due to the devil being inside them. They badly beat 2 older kids, but thankfully they survived the ordeal. We found more recent cases of children being killed in exorcisms in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. If you think belief in demonic possession is dead, you are very wrong. Number 26. Parts of the Bible talk about Jesus doing exorcisms. This is Mark chapter 1 verses 25-26. Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. It's a pity all exorcisms aren't so quick and easy. Number 25. The saying, "the devil is in the details," actually comes from "God is in the details." Number 24. Satan goes by other names as well as the devil, including Beelzebub, Mephistopheles, the Prince of Darkness, Lord of the Flies, the Antichrist, the Father of Lies, and Malak. Okay, back to more dark details. Number 23. In 1692, in Salem Village, Massachusetts, a group of young girls were accused of being in league with Satan. What happened next became known as the Salem Witch Trials. The accused girls, as well as women and men, appeared at a special court to address the accusation that they were getting friendly with the devil, which of course wasn't true at all. Number 22. 20 people in all were hanged by the neck in Salem for the crime of practicing the devil's magic, but over time, around 150 people were accused of being witches. One of the men who was executed was pressed to death, which had to be a very painful way to go. The authorities thought if he was tortured, he might spill the beans, but there weren't any beans to spill. A Massachusetts general court soon reversed the guilty verdicts, but that came too late for the 20 victims. The youngest of the accused was a 4-year-old girl named Dorothy Good. She told the court her mom had been talking to the devil. She was also said to bite people like a wild animal. The next fact is just plain crazy. Number 21. Believe it or not, animals played a big part in the hysteria that happened at Salem. Yeah, cats, dogs, and other animals were also said to be possessed by Satan. Some folks believe the animals were kind of a team member for the witches, and like some of the accused witches, they had to go. In one instance, a girl had convulsions and it was believed she was a witch. She said the neighbor's dog had bewitched her. That dog was immediately shot. A local minister later declared the dog innocent of any wrongdoing. Later, another mutt took a bullet even though the local said it was a victim of evil. Number 20. Did they really do a float test on accused witches, or is that just made up? It's not fiction at all, and it was in vogue in the 17th century. Sometimes called dunking or ordeal by water, it would involve throwing a person, usually a woman, into a river. If she sank, she was innocent of working with the Prince of Darkness, but if she floated, well, obviously she was in league with Satan. You might also wonder what the rationale was behind that, but let's remember the Age of Reason was still a century away. Some people said water was pure, and that's why it wouldn't accept witches. You really wouldn't want to show off your treading water skills in those days. Number 19. You might wonder what the difference is between a demon and the devil. Basically, the devil is the CEO of evil and demons are his managers. You could say those who demons possess are the folks on the lower end of the pay scale. Number 18. The American anthropologist Erica Bourguignon spent a lifetime studying demons, and she said 488 societies in the world believed in demonic possession. You don't need Satan to have demons, but you need evil. In the past, if you were mentally ill, sometimes people would say you were a victim of demonic possession. That still happens today in some societies. A psychiatrist in northern Thailand once said he took his team to the villages far from the city. In some villages, he found autistic kids locked in cages. The families would offer chicken sacrifices to the evil spirit so it would leave the kid's body. Coming up next is something called the Satan defense. Number 17. Satan gets the blame for a lot of bad things that people do, so you could call the poor fella a handy scapegoat. In 2016, a guy appeared in court after shooting 2 teenagers. One of them died and the other was badly injured. What was the guy's defense? He actually said Satan made him do it, and so he was actually innocent. The guy named Cody Lott was actually incensed when the media said killing 2 kids on their way home from school for absolutely nothing was senseless. Lott said the devil told him to do it, so how was it senseless? He will stay in prison until at least 2046. God might feature in the courtroom, but the justice system has no time for Satan. That's kinda weird when you think about it. Number 16. Satan has a little to do with Halloween. No one's exactly sure how the tradition started, but it likely goes back to harvest festivals that were held pre-Christianity. The Christians, however, got hold of it and started calling it All Hallows Day, which was a day to celebrate saints and the faithful that had died. This somehow turned into a night where people walk around dressed as Hello Kitty and maniacs put glass in candy. This next one is seriously messed up. Number 15. There's no shortage of people who claim they're the devil. These egomaniacs are everywhere and they span all age groups. A recent case involved a naked woman breaking into a family's house. The owner told her to leave, to which the woman laughed and then claimed she was the devil. All hell broke loose when the woman attacked the man and his family, even though he had a gun. 39 shots were fired, but the woman wasn't hit. Not only that, she also managed to fight off all the family. The man later said she had the strength of 4 grown men. Maybe she was the devil, or she'd been taking some serious drugs. You can find multiple stories every year in the USA where people do horrible things claiming to be the devil. For some reason, they're usually women. Number 14. There is a term she-devil, but it usually refers to a woman who manipulates men or does horrible things to them. While sometimes we refer to Satan as he, in reality or super reality, the devil is sexless. However, in Hebrew, the noun for Satan is a masculine noun. Number 13. If Satan is real, he must work around the clock, so he makes Elon Musk look lazy. That's because around 150,000 people die in the world every day of the week. Considering most of those people will not be faithful to God and will no doubt have a rap sheet of sins a mile long, the intake process for hell must keep Satan real busy. Number 12. In the Bible, it doesn't say Satan created hell. Nope, he was condemned to live in the inferno. He'd probably prefer a 3-bedroom suite in Manhattan, but sinners can't be choosers. The Bible actually teaches us that Satan spends most of his time on earth. Hell is a little confusing, so we thought we'd refer to that paragon of truth, Billy Graham. In his writing, he says the everlasting fire was created for the devil and his angels. He also says that the devil can roam through the earth going back and forth in it, and there's also the theory that sinners can be cast into the pits of hell only on Judgment Day, so right now they're on remand. Those who wrote the Big Book talk about Jesus mentioning eternal life and eternal punishment, but some Christian scholars argue that eternal punishment just means being wiped out, like completely being deleted from the big server in the sky, so hell could be absolutely nothing. The idea of a goat man with a pitchfork burning your toes with his cigar is entirely a modern fancy. It would have been alien to JC. Number 11. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a play about hell called No Exit. A well-known phrase from that play is hell is other people. In the play, people die and end up in a waiting room, but the thing is, they're there for eternity. They soon get on each other's nerves, and that waiting room becomes a kind of hell. It sounds a lot like social media. Okay, we've reached the top 10 now. Time to ramp up the evil. Number 10. Some Christians, mostly of the ilk that have Jesus bumper stickers, believe in something called the rapture. This is when the world ends and the goodies on earth, with the once faithful dead, will be beamed up into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. This great kidnapping will lead to eternity in heaven. As for those left behind, things aren't supposed to be great for them. Maybe they'll have a date with Satan at some point, or they just have to go on to act in very popular TV series. By the way, most Christians don't actually believe the big snatch will ever happen. Number 9. God was sometimes really wrathful. You certainly didn't want to get on the wrong side of God. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, God has some stern words with Satan, saying, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life." Number 8. You should know that you shouldn't make deals with Satan because whatever he gives, he'll take back, double. He once offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, but in the small print, there was a proviso stating that in return, Jesus had to worship Satan. Jesus' response to this offer was, "Away from me, Satan." Number 7. You've heard of the 7 deadly sins, but did you know some people say behind each one is a demon who can tempt you into committing that sin? The sins are pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. Satan himself is behind wrath. A prince of hell named Belphegor is the gluttony guy. He tries to convince folks to get really rich, which we all know in the real world gluttony has its fair share of problems. Number 6. What do you think is the most committed sin by men? Greed? Sloth? Nah, it's lust, according to some research we read. Think about how often every day you have a sexual thought. For women, that sin was pride. Number 5. Speaking of sexual thoughts, there are demons called incubi and succubi. The former is a demon in male form that makes love to women in their sleep, and the latter does the same, but she's female and chooses sleeping men. Such stories were around a long time before Christ appeared on the scene, so they're not only Christian stories. In the past, these demons were sometimes accused of messing with a man's health, while women were said to sometimes be impregnated by them. Maybe demons weren't the problem. Now for something very real. Number 4. There's a book called The Devil's Bible that was written by a monk over a period of decades in the 13th century. It's quite the tome, too, weighing in at 165 pounds. Some people believe the devil himself was behind the book, but most folks think that the writer just had a lot of time on his hands. If you wrote all day every day, the book would take about 20 years to finish. It got the name Devil's Bible because of an illustration on page 290. The legend behind the book says that a monk had broken his vows and faced being walled up alive. His other option was to agree to write a book that contained all human knowledge. That wasn't going to be so easy. But what's a monk going to do? He tried writing the book, but it was too hard, so the story goes that he asked Lucifer for help in exchange for his soul. All he had to do was feature that picture of the devil. Number 3. Okay, so how would you contact the devil if you wanted to do a deal with him? He's obviously a busy demon, and you can bet he has a lot of requests. We looked online for how to contact Satan, but there are no clear guidelines. There are a bunch of rituals you can find online that tell you how to summon demons, which usually involve evocation spells. There's a new book out there containing such spells, although the International Association of Exorcists condemned it, saying it was like putting a grenade in people's hands. It's aimed at kids, too, telling them if they have too much homework or life ain't going so well, they might want to draw some lines on the floor and dial up some demons. Number 2. The good news is that after looking at a bunch of Christian websites, not one agreed that the devil can read your thoughts. Satan, unlike God, is not omniscient. Nowhere in the Bible does it say the devil can plant things in your head. Watch out though, because this is in the Bible. Brothers and sisters, be sober, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. An interpretation of this could be that the devil is always there, just waiting for you to show some weakness. When he sees you're weak, he can somehow use his trickery to create circumstances around you that will tempt you to sin. He also has a network of demons doing such bad work. Demons that might have been busy during all those Catholic Church abuse scandals. Number 1. So what is the fate of Satan? Can't we just get rid of him? According to the Book of Revelations, at some point Satan will be forced to hang up his gloves. This is what's written about his forced retirement. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Only a select few priests in the Catholic Church are trained in exorcisms, and they're prepared for a rare and terrifying event: demonic possession. Over thousands of years, the Church has collected a bestiary of the most terrifying demons they've ever encountered. So which of these demons are the worst of the worst, and which are more like the annoying neighbor who just won't leave? From least to most terrifying, it's time to open the Church's Book of Demons. Number 11. Ben Tamalian, an obscure demon who appears in Jewish mythology before the rise of the Catholic Church. He only appeared once. A powerful emperor ruled his kingdom with an iron fist and passed harsh laws against the Jewish people. Then one day his daughter began behaving oddly, and it was soon clear that she was possessed by some sort of supernatural being. Among the other rantings that came out of the possessed girl, she began chanting the name of a famous rabbi in the kingdom, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The emperor was desperate and he decided to call upon this rabbi. The rabbi entered the princess's chamber and was prepared for a battle with the demon, but it wasn't to be. As soon as he yelled, "Ben Tamalian, go! Ben Tamalian, go!" the demon absconded. The princess was safe. The emperor was grateful, and he repealed the anti-Jewish laws. So not only did Ben Tamalian not hurt anyone, he left when asked politely by a man of God, and left the kingdom a better place thanks to his influence. Ben Tamalian is one step above a wacky guest star on a sitcom who teaches everyone a lesson about tolerance. This next demon could be dangerous if he could be bothered. Number 10. Belphegor. Belphegor is a powerful demon, one of the 7 princes of hell, and a representation of one of the 7 deadly sins. His specific sin? Sloth, which means his skills at possession might not be quite as ruthless as his brothers. He specializes in temptation, which means that once he gets into someone's body, he's more likely to make them lazy and cause them to slack off at their work. Sure, he's a risk that this guy will get you fired, but otherwise he's more likely to cause a few bad days until he gets bored. Where his danger lies is in how persuasive he is. He's one of the easier demons to summon since his sacrificial offering is excrement, and there's never any shortage of that lying around. He likes to suggest get-rich-quick schemes to people to lure them in, and he's appeared in multiple plays and novels as a trickster-style demon. Some of his most famous exploits involve testing people's marriages and searching for a mate of his own. As a high demon, he might be harder for an exorcist to shake off, but many of his victims might not even know they're possessed. This next demon is much more aggressive. Number 9. Andros. Among exorcists, Andros is known to strike fear. This winged demon has the head of an owl, the body of a human, and rides around on a fearsome wolf. When he possesses a human, he's notoriously hard to shake. In hell, he commands 30 infernal legions, and was notorious for striking out and killing the conjurer who summoned him if they weren't suitably protected. A great marquis of hell, he was known as a fearsome opponent, and driving him out of a human was a dangerous task. But was he dangerous to just leave there? While Andros is a dangerous demon, his primary tactic once he was possessing someone was simply to sow discord. He would talk to his host, trying to convince them to strike out at their enemies, and even give them advice on how to kill them. This makes Andros not much more than an annoying voice in your head that gives you bad advice. Sure, it might be hard to have him along for the ride long term, but eventually you just get used to it and say, "Shut up, Andros," every time he tries to get you to murder the office lunch thief. The next demon is dangerous, but maybe only one day of the week. Number 8. Aquiel. A minor demon, Aquiel is assigned by the big guy in hell to preside over Sundays, the holiest day in the Christian calendar. And as a demon, he has exactly one purpose: to desecrate the Christian Sabbath by any means necessary. That means if he possesses you, he could easily get you to do all sorts of horrible things on Sunday. Vandalizing a church, making all your employees work so they can't spend time with their family, stealing all the newspaper's colored comic sections, maybe. But there's one reason he's not the worst demon to be possessed by. For 6 out of 7 days, your life is likely to be pretty normal. And what does Aquiel have to do with the other 6 days of the week? Nothing. Someone possessed by Aquiel can foil the demon pretty easily, go about their life for 6 days of the week, and arrange for a friend to lock you up in a cage or tie you up on Sunday. Similar to how werewolves are contained on the night of the full moon in horror movies. Sure, you'll lose 1 day of the week, but Aquiel won't be able to get you involved in anything illegal, and he basically naps the other 6 days. Another demon has a lot of hype, but might not live up to it. Number 7. Azazel. If you ask people what they know about Azazel, they'll probably think he's one of the most terrifying demons out there. After all, the media has portrayed him as a yellow-eyed agent of destruction. But in reality, Azazel's actual role is far more mundane. He's a fallen angel like Lucifer, and one with a pretty ugly duty. Traditionally, communities would atone for their sins by transferring them to a goat that would then be sent off to be sacrificed, and the executioner would be none other than Azazel. So, what would this horned demon actually do with a possession? Well, odds are if you were possessed by Azazel, it would be because it's his time to do his duty and collect the literal scapegoat. He's also known for introducing humans to forbidden knowledge in Christian mythology, which means he might spend some time tempting people in your body. But he's not known for violence or for harming the people he possesses. As a powerful and ancient demon, he would likely be one of the hardest to shake, which is why it might just be best to let him do his job and move on. This next demon might be a little too much of a good thing. Number 6. Asmodeus. Another prince of demons, Asmodeus represents lust among the 7 deadly sins, and he's notorious for coming to Earth to indulge his carnal desires. The odds are if he possesses someone, they're about to undergo the supernatural version of the Hangover series, waking up after their possession with some scars they don't remember getting, 3 different wedding rings on their finger, and a warrant out for their arrest, and a feeling they just relived their wildest college fraternity days. But Asmodeus's lust sprees have a dark side. The demon is driven by pure unrestrained lust, and that can manifest itself in jealousy. Asmodeus is notorious for killing the spouses of women he desires, and so someone possessed by him could easily wind up charged with murder. Asmodeus might as well be the patron demon of Las Vegas. When you get possessed by him, you're rolling the dice between one hell of a weekend and a very rude wake-up call. Fortunately, he's also fairly easy to banish. He hates water, birds, and fish guts. Might want to hold the exorcism at the seashore. Some demons are less less infamous for what they do than for what they don't. Number 5. Surgat. Not much is known about Surgat, a minor demon mentioned in a book of magic and lore supposedly written by Pope Honorius. He was a notorious pope who liked to test fate by summoning demons himself. Also, he could learn the tricks of banishing them back down to hell. He believed he would eventually be called upon to fight Satan himself, and he was practicing by taking it out on his minions. But there was one minion he couldn't shake. Surgat is the only demon in the book whose banishing ritual is not discussed. That's because he was the only demon to stump Pope Honorius. He couldn't be shaken, and that led the Pope to give him an eerie nickname, He Who Opens All Locks. When one of the most powerful exorcists to ever live can't solve this minor demon, it stands to reason that he's one you don't want to find hitching a ride in your body. Should you be worried about this next demon? That depends on who you are. Number 4. Ronove. A high-ranking Marquis of Hell, Ronove was powerful and commanded 28 legions of demons. His actual interests were more benevolent. He fancied himself a teacher, and everyone who finds themselves possessed by him learns languages, rhetoric, and the skill of persuasion. This small staff-holding demon seems to want to create more evangelists for hell, and views humans as more convenient tools than something to torture. But if you're of a certain age, you might not survive a meeting with this demon. For most young people, a meeting with Ronove could be enriching. For the elderly or sick, it could be fatal. Ronove has a second deadly duty, the taking of old souls, making him a demonic version of the Grim Reaper. While he never kills anyone directly, should he possess an elderly person or animal, they're likely to die very soon after. But even more dangerously, those who are around the possessed person are likely to die if they're vulnerable. So maybe don't visit Grandma when Ronove comes knocking. This next demon has been the cause of many awkward situations. Number 3. Agares. A surprising number of demons take on the role of teacher, but few of them are as persuasive as Agares. Appearing as either an old man riding a crocodile or an incredibly beautiful woman, this Duke of Hell is good at getting people to let him in. And once he's in, he has a specific interest he can't wait to teach: language. Agares is a demon with knowledge of every language under the sun, and he has a specific interest in the most profane and obscene words around. Learning curse words might sound like every little boy's dream, but some of Agares' favorite words shouldn't be heard by anyone, and it just gets worse from there. Agares has multiple powers, including reportedly the ability to cause earthquakes. He commands 31 legions of demons, but his most dangerous ability is a subtle one. He has the power to force runaways or anyone who has left home to return to their origin. This doesn't seem that bad until you remember that he has you return to your parents' home, spewing horrible curse words from lost languages, and then he might just cause a fault line to appear right under your old home. But few demons create the fear this next one does. Number 2. Beelzebub. Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, is a high-ranking prince of hell. But what sin does he represent? Some say he represents pride, some say he represents gluttony, and others claim he's the prince of false gods. Christian lore says he fell alongside Lucifer, making him one of the first demons. While some traditions place him as the Lord of Hell himself, most believe he's just below him in the hierarchy, which makes him one of the most dangerous demons to be possessed by. And history shows he's one to be feared. Past incidents of possession, such as the mass possession of a nunnery in the 1600s, show that not only is Beelzebub hard to drive out, but his possession can spread. His victims show great hostility and can become violent, making him one of the hardest demons to banish. And as the Lord of the Flies, it's not surprising that his possessions are associated with mysterious manifestations of insects. So not only would being possessed by Beelzebub be a long-term thing and hard to end, but you might end up with flies in your teeth. And there's one demon still above him. Number 1. Lucifer, the Lord of Hell, the original fallen angel, Satan himself. He's the most feared figure in Christian mythology. So why are there so few reports of him possessing people? The late Father Gabriel Amorth, the founder of the International Association of Exorcists, claimed to confront Lucifer himself in a 1997 exorcism, but there's no way to prove if it was the genuine article. While the other demons serve him, the man himself rarely makes an appearance. After all, why would a boss do the minions' jobs? And that ambiguity might be the scariest thing about possession by Lucifer. Exorcists have very little information about how to banish him because of how few times he's appeared, and the few successful exorcisms have been long and difficult. If Lucifer comes out of hiding, the odds are he has a reason, and Christian mythology hints that direct involvement in the Lord of Hell in human affairs might be a sign of the end of times. That means if Lucifer possesses you, he might just be planning to use you to kick off the end of days. You'd surely be quite shocked if you met up with a friend and asked him why he hasn't been around for a while, and he responded that he'd been possessed by a demon. But at one point in history, and still now, people might actually claim demonic possession. Some people might even start speaking in a strange language, what's sometimes called speaking in tongues, or better known to paranormal experts as xenoglossy. People who are allegedly possessed might fly into mad rages or seem to exhibit superhuman strength, although the scientific community refutes all this and will tell you demonic possession is either a hoax or the person is suffering from a debilitating mental illness or a personality disorder. Still, what we want to know is what demons are supposedly out there ready to take over a person's body and mind. You can still find people today who claim they can perform the rites of exorcism for people suffering from diabolical possession. Although, when most of us think about this, we imagine it's related to one evil, and his name is Satan. In fact, believe it or not, a 2018 article in The Atlantic told us that the rate of Americans claiming they were possessed was on the rise. One official exorcist from the Archdiocese of Indianapolis said just in 2018 he'd received 1,700 emails or phone calls asking him to perform an exorcism, and that was just one father. The article talked about a girl who seemed to be suffering from anxiety, but then that got worse and she started doing strange things like growling and pulling out her hair. She'd rock back and forth like in the movies and twist her body into uncomfortable positions. She talked about God and the devil and then told her shocked parents and counselor that she wasn't in fact the girl they had come to know. The Atlantic cites some polls which revealed around half of the country believes in such demons. So with that in mind, we better have a look at what demons they might believe in. Theologian scholars have in the past attempted a classification of demons. Some scholars agree that looking at how demons have been talked about through the ages can help us better understand cultures. But we should tell you that there's a very long list of demons and many people have classified them in their own way. We think to shorten this list we'll stick with the Christian religion. We've done a whole show on Satan before, so we'll try and talk about demons you might not have heard of. We should finally add that while people nowadays may laugh at demonic possession, many people in the past were brutally tortured and killed because they were said to have conjured a demon or been inhabited by one. We don't mean to make light of that. Agaris. This demon has been described as an old man who rides a crocodile and carries around a hawk. He can do good things such as give a person titles, or bad things such as cause earthquakes. It's said by some people that if you're possessed by this demon, he can teach you all the languages of the world. But there's a downside to this, as all you'll say in those languages are the most offensive things. He'll also send you home if you run away, so he's not all bad. Balaam. This guy is very powerful and, in some texts, is one of the kings of hell. It's said he rules over 40 legions of demons, so he has quite a lot of influence. It might not be all that bad if you get possessed by him because it's written that he can give you perfect answers about the future, the present, and the past. He also has been known to make people witty and invisible. It's said he has 3 heads, with one head being the head of a bull, one a ram, and one a man. Fire might come out of his eyes, and he has a serpent's tail. He's not depicted as much of a walker, and usually rides a bear while he also carries a hawk. Chimaris. As we said already, there are many interpretations of demons and many names given to possibly the same demon. It just depends on what you're reading. This demon has been described as a great warrior who rides on the back of a black horse. He can make a man in his own image, which would be this great warrior, and he can also help a person to understand logic, grammar, and rhetoric. If that's not enough, he might lead the person to treasure, so all in all, this demon doesn't sound like the worst one to be possessed by. Aquiel. We can't say the same about this demon, who it's said will do anything to make the holy day of Sunday a terrible day. That might be your only day off of work, so we guess you don't want to see much of this demon in your life. Barbas. This demon sounds like something you should get on your side. If conjured, it's written that he first appears as a lion, which could be scary, but apparently with the right words you can change him into a man. In the 17th century, demonologists wrote that he will answer truly if you ask him anything, and he has unfathomable wisdom. He can cure pain and disease, but on the downside, he can also cause that. One of his biggest tricks is to be able to turn a man into other shapes, which could help you when you don't want to be seen. Gape. This demon is described in the book called The Lesser Key of Solomon, and also a bunch of other books. The word according to Gape is all about love, and while winged, bony, and with a head full of horns, he doesn't look very attractive. It's said he can change into human form when summoned. When we say he's all about love, that's both good and bad. It's said he can make women more attractive to men, but can also do the very opposite. He might provide medical care for a woman, or he might make them infertile. He can make men very knowledgeable, and if asked, he might also make an enemy very dumb. Paimon. If you've seen the horror movie Hereditary, you'll know that summoning this guy might not work out great for everyone. He can provide a person with great knowledge, give a person titles, or reveal hidden treasures, which might be all well and good if it doesn't involve killing many people close to you, as happened in the movie. Marchosius. This is a winged wolf that spews fire from its mouth and has a serpent's tail, and for that reason, once you've summoned it, you might think about turning it into a man. Once that's happened, you'll be given true answers to all questions, and it will be very faithful to the summoner. But in the 1577 hit book, Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, this beast is described as being cruel, so we're not quite sure where this demon lands on the good-bad scale. Zepar. This great Duke of Hell looks a lot like a soldier, but his power is to make women fall madly in love with men. He might do that, but he might also take away that woman's chance of giving birth. Mammon. There are lots of different interpretations of this demon, but they're all bad and all related to money and greed. A mammon is a fallen angel that values wealth and treasure over all things. Amusingly, in the 1818 book Dictionary Infernal, it was described as being Hell's ambassador to England. This demon has been used as a metaphor for the pitfalls of greed and valuing money over everything. Once said to be a being carried up from hell by a wolf coming to inflame the human heart with greed. In the USA years later, some critics said the Mammon was the demon of Wall Street, of predatory moneylenders, and in one picture looks quite a lot like Scrooge. Murmur. The much nicer sounding Murmur is said to be a great duke and earl of hell and has 30 legions of other demons underneath him. He's described as a soldier who rides either a vulture or a griffin and wears a dual crown. When he flies, he has 2 trumpeters playing for him. One of his great tricks is bringing back the souls of the dead. Once he's done that, the conjurer can then ask these souls anything he wants and he'll get an answer. Pursan. This guy is quite an authority in hell, and he likes to blow a trumpet. He looks pretty cool riding a bear, holding an angry viper in his hands. He also has a lion's head. When summoned, he can answer pretty much anything about the hidden mysteries of the world. If it's just cash you want, he also knows how to find treasure. Succubus. You might have heard of this kind of demon, which is said to be female and can enter the dreams of men in the night. Well, we guess she works day shifts too for people who like napping. She will seduce guys in the night, but that might not work out well for the man. It's said if he partakes in her seduction, he may become very unwell and even die. She's more folkloric than actually featured in the demonology books we've mentioned. There is a kind of male version of her that visits women and is called an incubus. Back in the bad old days, some people would write that a woman could fall pregnant to such a demon, and that's why some kids were born deformed. How it apparently was done was that the succubus would collect the male sperm and then deliver it to the incubus, and he would impregnate the woman with it. Vepar. This demon might have been useful in war because he could apparently control the seas. If you summoned him, he could make the seas rough for others or smooth for you. He can also request to make a person's skin full of sores that will leak worms. He can reverse that if asked by the conjurer. Surgat. This is just a minor demon and he's a one-trick pony. His power is that he can unlock all doors. You might have heard of him from the movie Bird Box. Phoenix. We're told this demon isn't very bad at all and hopes one day to get back into heaven. Apparently, that never happened and won't happen. He will be very obedient to the conjurer and can teach a person about the sciences or the arts. He might even make someone a great poet. He's said to look like the mythical bird the phoenix and can be heard flying around singing songs with the voice of a sweet child. To get anything out of him, though, you have to turn him into a human. According to the book Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, it is possible if you have an exorcist handy. Borneus. This great marquis of hell usually appears in human form, and he just makes things right for people in their social life. He'll make sure all your friends love you, and better still, he'll make sure your enemies love you too. All in all, if you can conjure this demon, you'll just have a good name about town. Astaroth. This is one of the top demons, said to be part of the evil trinity with Beelzebub and Lucifer. He's been described by one demonologist as a great and strong duke coming forth in the shape of a foul angel sitting upon an infernal dragon and carrying on his right hand a viper. He looks for people who are weak and makes them lazy and full of self-doubt. He can also make men invisible and give them power over the serpents of the world, so we guess like most demons he can grant power and take it away. He was a master of deception, articulate and artful. He would become to some the black sheep of the papacy, a pope whose lust for wealth and power knew no bounds. The great Italian writer Niccolò Machiavelli, who wrote the world's most renowned book on unscrupulous politicians, once said of this pope, he never did anything or thought of anything other than deceiving men. We might add women to that too, because this incorrigible and corrupt pope fathered quite a few illegitimate children. He was also renowned as being something of a smooth talker and not hard on the eyes to females. Some say he sold his soul to the devil and would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Welcome to the life of the bad pope, Alexander VI. He was born on the first day of the new year in 1431 and was named Rodrigo de Borja, which was the Italianized version of his Spanish name. The pope-to-be came from a noble background, from an Italo-Spanish family that was part of the House of Borgia. During the Italian Renaissance, their power extended across Europe, and together the families would be accused of many, many crimes. These days, when some historians speak of the Borgias, attendant are the tales of murder, adultery, theft, nepotism, and rampant corruption. Their sins were plentiful, to say the least. During his early life, Rodrigo studied law at the University of Bologna, but when his uncle was made pope and so head of the Catholic Church, the 25-year-old Alexander was made a cardinal. This didn't take much effort since nepotism was the order of the day back then. Those in the family were given prominent positions on the basis that they were part of the family. Merit didn't count for much. Just a year later, and Rodrigo found himself in position of Vice Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church. For the next decade, he lived not how one would think. Seeing that he held a position in the church, he did not dedicate his entire life to the service of God, and instead spent much of his time amassing a fortune and spreading his seed. In 1468, he was ordained into the priesthood, but this did not change his ways. He wanted wealth and power, and he wanted to seduce those he was attracted to. He was, after all, very rich, but in younger years, he was also a handsome man who had a way with words. It's thought he had 7 children in total, and 4 of the kids he had was to a woman named Vanosa de Catane. Those 4 have gone down in the history books, especially his son, Cesare Borgia. In later years, Rodrigo would become the Archbishop of Valencia, and when he gave up that post, Cesare would take it over. His stepping down from this position happened because of a death in the papacy. This was the death of Pope Innocent VIII, which happened on the 25th of July in 1492. A new pope was needed, and now the 67-year-old Rodrigo wanted that position. There were 2 other men also vying to be pope. Rumors surfaced that Rodrigo paid vast amounts of money to bribe certain people and ensure his ascendancy to the head of the Catholic Church. It wasn't only him, though. Chroniclers at the time wrote that all 3 contenders ran very expensive campaigns. 200,000 gold ducats can go a long way in politics, and after being made head of a church, a person could do certain people a lot of favors. We say politics because the church was steeped in politics. Rodrigo won and was made Pope Alexander VI on the 11th of August 1492. A wolf was now in the big seat, and in time he would share a place in the Christian Church's Hall of Infamy. The Roman people were happy with the result since Rodrigo was a popular man, and they might have cheered him as he began to talk about justice and order. He went about papal business in a way that impressed the populace, and also started some grand building projects. Things were looking up for the new pope, but then his power got the better of him. He soon started granting his relatives positions in the church, and those positions would give a person power and wealth. Doing these favors is a practice known as simony. This made him as many friends as it made him enemies. People started asking if the new pope was more interested in advancing his relatives' power and their wealth than he was in the Catholic Church. Problems were brewing, though, because a French invasion was imminent. The French king had laid claim to Naples, but that's a story in itself. Alexander was well aware that the French wouldn't stop at just taking Naples, so something had to be done about the threat. The Pope formed an alliance, which would become known as the League of Venice, or the Holy League. There wasn't really anything holy about it. It was an alliance that joined together some of the wealthiest people in Europe, and they all agreed to stop France in its tracks and sought to take over parts of Europe. It would grow to include a number of European states, all of them united against the French. What all this resulted in the end, was more power for Alexander. In total, he appointed 47 new cardinals to further enhance his power. Then, something terrible happened to the Pope. Remember, we told you about 4 of his children that all had a certain amount of influence themselves. Those 4 children were named Cesare, Geoffrey, Lucrezia, and Giovanni. The latter, sometimes named Juan, was murdered. This man held a lot of positions, notably the second Duke of Gandia, Duke of Sessa, the Governor of St. Peter's, the Grand Constable of Naples, and Gonfalonier and Captain General of the Church. When you were born a Borgia, gaining titles such as these was inevitable. On the night of the 14th of June 1497, Juan had attended a feast with many people, including his 3 siblings. He left that feast on horseback, and the next day as the sun rose, his horse was seen wandering around without a rider. Juan was presumed missing since no one had seen him. He was soon found, though, with his throat slit and his body stabbed 9 times. An investigation was launched, and it was first thought that the murder could have been related to a feud with another noble family, although some people thought his own brother Giuffre had done the act. Others said that the other brother, Cesare, had committed the vicious crime. No one ever found out who the assassin was. Juan had many enemies, not only over power feuds, but because he was also infamous for his lust and relationships with countless women. Alexander went into a dark phase after this, but came out saying that from now on, he was going to dedicate all his life to reform and morality in the name of God. Those might have been empty words, given he was also so embedded in power struggles. There were some people who believed he and Cesare had poisoned one of his own cardinals, since a cardinal's wealth went back to the church after their death. Some poor people who got stuck in the middle of this affair didn't admit that Alexander had been involved, but it has to be said their confession was extracted through torture. The torturers worked for Alexander's worst enemy, Julius II. That Julius didn't like Alexander is something of an understatement. He despised the man, and when Alexander's reign as pope ended, Julius would become the next pope. When he gained that position, this is what he had to say about Alexander and the entire Borgia family. "I will not live in the same rooms as the Borgias lived. He, Alexander VI, desecrated the Holy Church as none before. He usurped the papal power by the devil's aid, and I forbid under the pain of excommunication anyone to speak or think of Borgia again. His name and memory must be forgotten. It must be crossed out of every document and memorial. His reign must be obliterated." Something you've all heard about happened when Alexander was pope, and that was when a man named Christopher Columbus arrived at a place we now call North America. Back then it was just the New World. But what about the natives who lived there? Well, Alexander issued a set of decrees called papal bulls that granted the ownership of certain parts of these new lands to certain noble people. There are some historians that say Alexander gave those people the right to make the natives of these newfound lands their slaves, although others just say the decrees were only supposed to ensure the natives were converted to Christianity. Yet others say the natives were given an option: either submit to your new rulers or face an attack. Inside Rome, Alexander was always threatened by factions that wanted to bring him down. He had many critics too, and they weren't afraid to speak out. One such critic was the head of a monastery, and he was named Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola said the church had to shape up, and it had to be rid of its corruption. He said the concern should be, and always should have been, practicing religion and concentrating on helping the poor. He actually became known as the preacher of the despairing. To this day, Alexander is symbolic with the corruption of the Catholic Church, and he paved the way for the rise of Protestantism. That would happen not long after Alexander passed away. His day of reckoning with his god was the 18th of August, 1503. Alexander had been feeling ill the previous few days and had a temperature. There was some bloodletting to try and improve his sickness, but that didn't help. He knew he was on his way out, and on the 18th he made a confession to the bishop. Surrounded by cardinals, he died sometime later. His body was presented to a clergy of Rome a day after that, but decomposition had already altered the way he looked. One historian wrote, "It was a revolting scene to look at, that deformed, blackened corpse, prodigiously swelled and exhaling an infectious smell. His lips and nose were covered with brown drivel." If that doesn't sound horrible enough, another witness wrote that his body was the ugliest, most monstrous and horrible dead body that was ever seen, without any form or likeness of humanity. There are theories that suggest the way the body looked was perhaps due to him having been poisoned, and by his own son Cesare no less. Others said he merely died a very diseased man, and this is what was to blame for the fast decomposition. A lot of negative things were said about the Pope, but on the positive side, he devoted much of his time to promoting the arts. A man you might have heard of named Michelangelo had the support of Alexander. He wasn't the only artist to work for him either. Alexander also got behind education and issued decrees for the building of universities. He approved the construction of what would one day become the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he also approved the construction of the University of Valencia. Still, the Catholic Church remained mired in controversy, and 14 years after Alexander died, a German reformer named Martin Luther would famously walk up to a church and nail his 95 Theses to the door. This outlined the corruptions of the Catholic Church, and many people approved. Luther's words would spread around Europe as fast as a plague. Luther's words in modern parlance went viral, and the world was forever changed. Wars of religion would be fought, and many people would be persecuted and killed over many years. We'll leave you with a quote from Alexander. "Who are we to trust if not our family?" His problem might have been keeping things in the family a little too much, and if the stories are true, his family weren't exactly the most virtuous people in the world. Would you sell your soul to Satan to avoid a horrific death? Would you do anything he asked, even defile the faith you've devoted your life to, and create an enduring symbol of his dark power for future generations to see? You probably wouldn't expect to see a grinning face of the devil to be staring up at you from the center pages of the largest Bible you've ever seen. This depiction of evil is only scratching the surface of the mysteries that lay buried in the titanic pages of the Codex Gigas. The story of its creation begs an ominous question about its authorship. Was it penned by a mortal, or something both greater and lesser? To answer this question, before we even dare to open the Devil's Bible, we need to head back to the time it was created. If there was one thing you could praise the Middle Ages for, it was their creativity. At least creativity in terms of torture and execution. While food shortages and poverty gripped much of Europe, there was never a shortage of new and inventive ways to mutilate, humiliate, and murder your fellow human beings. Strapped onto the rack, you'd have your limbs each tied with ropes or shackles. These would then be pulled further and further apart, cranked harder by a team of executioners, as one by one all of your joints would pop out of place before finally tearing apart under the immense strain. Or how about the opposite of that? The scavenger's daughter. You'd be forced into a kneeling position with your chest against your thighs. A metal band would wrap around you, tying you into this position ever tighter and tighter. Your ribs would snap, piercing your internal organs as your spine pops out of alignment. One particularly dramatic example was the brazen bull, a hollow brass bowl that would be opened up through a hatch on the side, with the victim bundled inside behind lock and key. Without a hope of getting out, a fire would be lit underneath the bull, steadily raising the temperature of the metal oven higher and higher. They made it into the shape of a bull because the muted screams that would escape the torture chamber would sound just like a raging bull as it would buck and shake. Then, of course, there is the pear of anguish, a small device, the shape of an upside-down pear. Twisting it at the base would open the pear up, expanding it to be larger and larger. They'd take this pear and they'd insert it, well, you get the idea. There was no shortage of ways to be killed in the Middle Ages. One of the more tame in terms of physical anguish, but right up there in terms of psychological torment, had to be those that were walled up. Not all of us have claustrophobia. Many of us like to think that we're just fine in tight enclosed spaces. But even the most daring and extreme cave diver would find that exact same unbearable panic in their chest the moment they realized they're trapped without a hope of escape. That was the principle behind immurement. It was a very simple execution method, really. A person would be forced to stand in one spot as a stone wall was built around them. Too narrow for them to sit down or stretch out their limbs, they'd be stuck in what Guantanamo Bay guards would now call a stress position. With the final stone laid and all daylight robbed from them, the execution would officially begin. With no immediate threat other than total immobilization, they would just have to stay in that exact spot and wait to die from dehydration several days later, trapped with their thoughts, which would soon turn to waking nightmares. This method of killing was an efficient deterrent. You would hear the anguished cries of the victim inside for a long time. You could even have a conversation with them through the stone as they steadily lost the remaining shreds of their sanity. Not everyone placed in immurement was to be executed, however. Sometimes it was just used as a temporary punishment, particularly within the church. They'd bury you underground or brick you up behind a wall for whatever period of time they saw fit. You just better pray they didn't forget you. Some holy women even chose to undergo immurement voluntarily. They would be bricked up with a slit to receive food and water for extended periods of time, sometimes as long as decades, as a way of stripping back distractions and temptations from their life so they could focus solely on God. Most terrifying about this voluntary immurement was that they would often take children in with them. Kids aged about 10 years old who'd been donated to the church by their parents would act as symbols of purity and innocence that these holy women could keep for company in their walled-off space for years at a time. It's safe to say that very few people would want to do this kind of thing, though, particularly if it was to be your method of execution. And so begins the legend of the Gigas Codex, the Devil's Bible, and how it came to be written. Our story starts in the Kingdom of Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, in the 13th century. It was an imperial state of the Roman Empire, and as such practiced Roman Catholicism. Monasteries dotted the land with pious men committed to the lives of poverty and religious ritual after having taken their monastic vows. Vows, which made in the presence of God, would have 3 pillars: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty stated they were to live their lives devoid of material wealth. They were to own nothing themselves but share everything communally within the monastery. Clothes, meals, all necessities were to be stripped back and basic as possible. Discomfort was encouraged at every turn. After all, Matthew 20:16 tells us, "He who is last shall be first." Chastity meant a total abandonment of all sexual thought and activity. Monks were to be totally pure in body and mind, abstaining from any kind of sexual pleasure and practicing total self-control at all times. Their physical urges were temptations from the devil that would lead them away from the purity that God had called them to. And finally, obedience. They were to submit absolutely to the authority of God, the Bible, and the Roman Catholic Church, and the order of monks whom they had joined. Those who had joined the order prior to themselves or occupied superior positions in the monastery were to be obeyed at all times. These conditions were at best totally restrictive and at worst totally impossible to follow. Total obedience while living a life of poverty. Total chastity year after year without an impure thought or deed allowed. These standards were so high that they would have taken immense levels of self-control to achieve. At any moment, any monk was at risk of falling short of these standards and breaking their monastic vows. Enter Herman the Recluse, our protagonist. We'd love to be able to tell you what it was that he'd done that had got him in so much trouble, but sadly those details have been lost in the mists of time. So let your imagination run wild. Perhaps he swiped some solid gold chalices used for the Eucharist that he was going to run away with and sell to buy himself a better life. Maybe it was something as minor as him stealing a couple extra bread rolls at dinner. Or maybe he punched the oldest monk of the monastery for looking at him funny. We'll never know. What we do know is that he was in trouble. Big trouble. Enough trouble to get himself walled up. Dragged in front of a tribunal of senior monks, Herman the Recluse was desperate. He'd seen others executed the same way for breaking their vows plenty during his time at the monastery. He couldn't let it happen to himself. He begged and pleaded with the monks. There had to be something he could do to make it right. He would commit the rest of his life to making things better. Perhaps if he managed to perform some great feat, it would atone for his wrongdoing. They just needed to give him some time, that's all he needed. The monks looked at one another and muttered. When they looked at him again, their faces were icy cold. He was to have one night. Herman's face fell. Just one night. What could he possibly do with that time to prove his worth to the monks? He'd need nothing short of a miracle to avoid execution tomorrow. Herman was dragged from the room and locked away in his quarters at the monastery. With him were all the tools and materials needed to write a book. He got to work as soon as the door closed behind him. As much as he wanted to, he knew he couldn't rush his work. He was writing something holy that would stand for generations. It needed to be perfect. His handwriting had to be exemplary. But after hours of work, he barely made a dent. He was trying to write out the text of the Bible, but he hadn't even managed a page yet. With the ornate illustrations, elaborate lettering, and just the sheer scope of work, he was nowhere close to having something of value to take to the monks the following morning. He'd been praying to God in desperation all night, but he had not heard a thing back. Daybreak was approaching. There was nothing for it. Herman prayed to Satan. When the monks arrived and unlocked his door the following morning, they were all stunned. Complete on Herman the Recluse's deck was an enormous book, almost as large as the man himself. It was open to a page somewhere in the middle. The men hissed quietly at the image before them. Emblazoned across the page was a large and beautifully realized drawing of the devil himself. Herman, what have you done? Okay, so that was all fictional. Well, partially. Because the book from that story, The Devil's Bible, does exist. You can go and see it today in the Swedish National Library, where it has sat proudly on display for centuries. We'll get back to the mythology in a bit, but first some of the facts. The book is called the Codex Gigas, a Latin name that literally translates to giant book. And boy does it live up to that name. The Codex Gigas is 92 centimeters in length. Its 650 pages along with the leather-bound wood covers make it 22 centimeters thick. At 72 kilograms, it's heavier than the average person from every continent in the world except for North America, which narrowly beats it. This book is not meant for light reading in any sense of the word. While initially it's the size of the Codex Gigas that strikes you, as you inspect it more closely, it's the artistry at play that really enthralls you. The book is held together with these beautifully ornate metal guards and fittings. Open it up and you find that every page is a work of art. Adorned on each page are what's called illuminations, An illumination is where you don't just have a page of plain text, but you embellish it. You surround it with patterns, illustrations, and colors. Not only would the artist have painstakingly handwritten every word in the book to look perfect, they would have then spent hours or days filling out the rest of the page with these illuminations. At the start of every chapter, you'll find the first letters have been capitalized and blown up to take up a large portion of the page. Golds, greens, reds, and yellows all intertwine to create incredibly detailed and intricate renderings of even the most basic letters. There are pages of illustrations filling up the book too, in between the blocks of text that adorn the paper. Except the paper itself isn't paper at all, it's vellum. 620 pages made from 310 leaves of vellum, folded and bounded together. What's vellum, you might be asking? Animal skin, treated and stretched out thin and taut so as to be written on. It's estimated that upwards of 160 donkeys were slaughtered to provide the vellum for this book. Take a second to imagine just how many donkeys that is. How much of an income those donkeys would have provided in the 13th century. All were killed in pursuit of creating the Codex Gigas. It would have been incredibly valuable at the time, and that value has only risen in the 800 years since. Aside from all the reasons we just outlined, this book has a lot of things going for it that make it incredibly important historically and culturally to this day. For starters, it's the largest medieval manuscript in the world, by quite some margin. You'd struggle to find many books this kind of size from any time period, but from the Middle Ages, nothing compares. So what's inside this tome that makes it so special, and why is it called the Devil's Bible? Well, for starters, there's the Bible. Not a twisted Satanist version of it, but the actual Bible, an early version of it known as the Vulgate Bible. The history of all the different Bible translations and versions is long and deeply fascinating, but probably not a topic to fully delve into in this video, so we'll give you the SparkNotes version of what the Vulgate Bible was. The original Bible manuscripts were not all written in the same language. Almost all of the Old Testament texts, the books written before Jesus' life, were in the Jewish language Hebrew, but mixed in there were the books of Daniel, Ezra, and Jeremiah, which all featured a language called Aramaic. This language blew up in the years between the completion of the Old Testament and the time of Jesus' birth, to the point where it likely is that Jesus spoke Aramaic during his lifetime. And yet, the New Testament was written about Jesus' life and the birth of the early church after, and it was all written in ancient Greek, since that was the scholarly language of the era. This meant anyone who wanted to read all the Christian scriptures and learn the whole story had to be literate in 3 different languages. That's a tall order even with modern education, let alone the inconsistent schools and the universities of the Dark Ages. Enter St. Jerome, who made it his mission to translate all these scriptures into Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, and therefore much of the Western world. In 405 AD, Jerome completed the first version of his translation and called it the Vulgate. He continued to tweak and improve it over the course of the rest of his life, but in its various forms, this became arguably the most significant translation of the Bible in history, even more important than the King James Version, which translated the scriptures into English. Unofficially, the Roman Catholic Church relied on this version of the Bible for centuries, as it now meant that the people only needed an understanding of Latin to access the entire story of Christianity. Over 1,000 years later, the Roman Catholic Church finally made it the official translation of the Church, a position which the Vulgate would retain all the way up until as recently as 1979. So the Codex Gigas had picked the right horse in terms of biblical translations. Its version is slightly different to others. The books of the Bible are arranged in a different order to usual, and it uses a combination of different iterations of St. Jerome's translations. But what is most interesting is that there's a lot more in those 620 pages than just the Bible. The Codex Gigas is so important to us historically today because it acts as a kind of compendium for the knowledge of the time. Contained between its 2 covers is a vast and varied account of much of Bohemian society's knowledge at the time. This collection tells us what people knew or thought they knew about the world around them and gives us enormous insight into their lives as a result. Take Isidore of Seville's encyclopedia Etymologiae, for example. In this book, Isidore does his best to recount all of human knowledge on mathematics, canon law, philosophy, the human body, geography, shipbuilding, weights and measures, rhetoric, and so much more. One of the most fascinating and entertaining parts of this book comes in the zoology section, where Isidore confidently explains that hedgehogs feed their offspring by climbing up vines and skewering the grapes on their spines to then deliver to their waiting children. complete with illustrations. The whole encyclopedia is included in the Codex Gigas, as is Josephus's 20-volume history of all the Jewish people and his writings about the Jewish war. On top of these are multiple books all about medicine, all of which would have been incredibly useful at the time, as well as a history of the Czech lands up to that point. There are prayer books, instructions on performing the Eucharist, a calendar containing a list of notable deaths, and a set of magic formulae. This book is sprawling in every sense of the word, not just the physical. The author had wanted to include everything they possibly could to capture the knowledge of their people in one cohesive book that would stand the test of time. It's the equivalent today of printing out the entirety of Wikipedia to place into a library where any future civilization can access it. Actually, it's more incredible than that. It's like handwriting Wikipedia and drawing all the illustrations for it yourself. We've been talking all this time about an author, singular. Most historians coming to a text like this would expect it to be the work of a whole team of writers and illustrators. That is invariably how books this large are to be produced. There is so much work to do, there's no way just one person could do it all themselves. But this is where we come to the most fascinating thing about the Codex Gigas, the thing that ties all this back to the mythology surrounding the book. Handwriting experts analyzing the text from the very first page of the book all the way through to the very last page of the book can't help but conclude one thing. It's the same. The handwriting in the Codex Gigas is unbelievably, almost impossibly uniform. One person wrote the entire thing. Not only did just one person write it, but they wrote it at an incredibly consistent quality over the course of their whole life. The text alone in the Codex Gigas, ignoring all the illuminations and illustrations, has been estimated to have taken 20 years to write. That's not 20 years of writing 8 hours a day with a good night's sleep. That's 20 years of straight writing with no breaks. This is not just a job for a monk. It was their entire life's work and purpose. They would have had to have started writing as a young man or even a teenager and continued all the way through what's likely the end of their life given mortality rates of the time. And yet, there's still more to be impressed with. One of the things scholars have noted that is most remarkable about the book is its incredible consistency. We mentioned the handwriting being uniformly from the same person, but the consistency also applies to the quality of the work. If you were to sit down and write a 3,000-word essay by hand, chances are your handwriting's going to look noticeably worse on the final sentence than it does on the first. Your hand grows tired, your attention drifts, your brain gets fuzzy, and you get lazier. That's over the course of a day. Now expand that work out to the course of your life. Your handwriting may improve over time with practice, but it may get worse as you get older and start losing your eyesight. Your hands might ache from RSI, seize up from arthritis, or shake from Parkinson's. All of these things impact your handwriting, making it sloppier and more erratic. That doesn't happen in the Codex Gigas. This author, this inspired individual, somehow retains the same level of detail, precision, and creativity throughout the whole book. The level of artistry they demonstrate as a teenager or a young man is consistent with their craftsmanship as a veteran after decades of work. Like we said, it's almost impossible. How could one person do all of this themselves? Which brings us back to the legend surrounding the book and the reason it was given the name Devil's Bible in the first place. Emblazoned in the middle of the book is the most striking and well-realized illustration in the whole book. It's a double-page spread. On one side is an illustration of heaven, on the other side stands the devil himself. 50 centimeters tall, he takes up over half of the available page, which has been left mostly empty around him. He squats on the page, seemingly ready to pounce. His arms are raised high above his head, with 4 clawed fingers on each hand. Across his waist is a loincloth of what's believed to be ermine furs, a common symbol for royalty. He is Satan, king of the devils. His expression is somewhere between a smile and a snarl. Madness fills his eyes, sharp teeth line his mouth, and snaking its way out of his mouth are 2 tongues, forked from somewhere deep in his mouth. The pages all around this one are discolored and worn. For centuries, people have been coming to this book and immediately flicking through to this exact page. And it's from this illustration that the legend of Herman the Recluse came. How could one man, even across a whole lifetime, produce a work so grand, so complete, so intricate, and so consistent? He couldn't. It wasn't done by a man at all. It was done by the devil. That's why there's such a large and detailed illustration of Satan in the middle of it all. The legend goes that Herman the Recluse was scheduled for execution by a Muirmund. Desperate to be freed from his fate, he had one night to produce a work sufficient to earn redemption. Out of fear, he prayed to the devil in the dark of the night, and the devil answered. Satan himself finished the book for Herman, That's why it was so perfectly consistent, but as payment he required that Herman include a large illustration in his honor in the center. That, and that Herman give him his soul. Today we can look at this book and know it's totally harmless. There's no dark sorcery at play, no Satan influence, it's just a book. An encyclopedia of 13th century Bohemia made by one man. But staring into the eyes of Satan in the middle of the book, you'll notice that his gaze follows you around the room. But it's all totally harmless, right? It's late at night and you're having a pleasant dream. Maybe you're reliving one of your favorite memories. Or you're having that dream where you're a flying superhero again, saving the world from destruction. Perhaps you're a knight in shining armor fighting off a fire-breathing dragon, but not for the hand of a helpless maiden, because this is the 21st century and maidens are more than capable of saving themselves. Suddenly though, your pleasant little dream escape starts to turn dark. You get a growing feeling of dread and foreboding. Your nice fantasy slowly turns into a nightmare. You wake up with a gasp, happy to flee from the dark dream, but realize you've woken into a real-life horror. You can't move, you can barely breathe, and no matter how hard you try, your limbs refuse to respond to your commands. You lie in bed, panting for breath, completely paralyzed, and there in the darkness of your room, you swear that you can see a vague figure. It seems to be watching you, smiling even. And then in a flash, it's gone and you can move your body again. You tear out of bed and throw the lights on, but you're all alone in your room without another person in sight. It's estimated that about 15% of the population has had an experience like the one we just described. And if you're one of the lucky ones who hasn't, your time may be coming. For millennia, this phenomenon, now called sleep paralysis, has been associated with one particular evil being. A female demon ripped straight from the pages of the world's most ancient texts, and today known as the night hag. According to science, this phenomenon is not an evil demon visiting you and poisoning your dreams or trying to kill you. Sleep paralysis is a purely natural phenomenon that happens when you wake up, but your brain hasn't fully alerted the rest of your body that it's time to wake up. If you've ever watched someone else sleep, then you're kind of a creeper. Just kidding. But if you've seen someone jerk around in their sleep, or perhaps watched a dog kick and paw and whimper as they dream of chasing squirrels, then you're well aware that sometimes our body responds to what the brain is pretending we're doing in our dreams. Scientists aren't quite sure why we dream in the first place, and the fact that less intelligent animals such as dogs and cats do it mean that it isn't a simple byproduct of our greater intellectual capacity and ability to imagine. Some believe that dreaming is the brain's safe way of working through troubling memories, or to give itself a break from the stresses of real life. Others believe that dreaming is the way that the brain processes information and helps it to learn from mistakes or develop new strategies to past problems. Others yet believe that dreams are largely meaningless or are a random mixture of memories and imagination with no discernible purpose, just something the brain does while in standby mode. What we do know, though, is that in order to protect you while dreaming, the brain automatically paralyzes your body. That's so when you're thrashing around in your dreams fighting off a grizzly bear with your bare fists, you don't start throwing haymakers in the real world and maybe break your hand on the wall. Have a particularly vivid dream of running a marathon, and your body might start running in real life, straight off a cliff or into a predator. Some people believe that the act of sleepwalking is actually the brain failing to fully do its job properly and shut the body down. It's clear that this sleep paralysis is pretty important for our safety and the safety of anyone sleeping next to us. Waking up in the midst of sleep paralysis, however, can be a traumatic and terrifying experience. The brain has accidentally forgotten to throw the on switch to the other parts of your body, and so when you try to move, you're unable to. Because you have so little control of your body, your breathing feels shallow and labored, and this gives the impression of a great force sitting on your chest. Stuck in a waking state where the brain is still partially dreaming, people have even described auditory and visual hallucinations that appeared completely real to them. In fact, some people believe that sleep paralysis perfectly describes the alien abduction phenomenon. That's science's answer, at least, and given the fact that it's 2019 and we still don't have flying cars, are you really gonna trust science? Of course not. Before the sleep paralysis theory, this phenomenon was directly attributed to the legendary night hag, a demonic being who would visit men and women and sit on their chests, infecting them with terrible dreams and draining their life force. What's startling is that the night hag is present in every single culture on Earth, and the various qualities attributed to her are shockingly similar. She's often described as a female figure, some claiming that she's a demon and others that she's a ghost, and she pins her victims down and steals their breath. The night hag seems to have existed for as long as humanity has been around, and she's mentioned in the world's most ancient texts. She's generally believed to be Lilith, the original wife to Adam, who did not wish to be his second and left the Garden of Eden. Others believe that Lilith was never human in the first place and was in fact a demoness who preys on men and women alike. Whatever her real origin, she appears in the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls. She's also featured prominently in the mystical Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, and men all across the ancient world were warned to be wary of her presence. Not just men though, as the vengeful Lilith would often seek out pregnant women and newborn children and try to kill them in their sleep. In some traditions, Lilith is even described as having breasts full of poison instead of milk, which she feeds to newborn infants. The name Lilith is believed to be a derivative of the ancient Sumerian word for Lilitu, which were female demons and wind spirits. Beautiful and seductive, men were nevertheless warned to keep their distance from these temptresses, as they would often attempt to reproduce with men and then kill them shortly after. Able to bear children with either human or animals, the night hag prefers to reproduce with men and disguise herself as a human to give the child away for adoption, returning later to transform its daughters into night hags once they've reached puberty. In the Jewish Zohar, which is the foundation for the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, Lilith the night hag is mentioned a whopping 27 times. These depictions support the idea that she was Adam's first wife, but refused to see herself as subservient to Adam and rebelled against God by showing him great disrespect. Saddened by Lilith, God cast her out of the Garden of Eden and then formed a new woman for Adam directly from his rib, as Lilith had been made from the same dust as Adam had originally. Given the traditional view of these ancient cultures which held women in very low regard, it's no surprise that Lilith's refusal to be subservient forever to a man was seen as evil. Christianity doesn't believe Lilith was the first wife of Adam though, and certainly doesn't believe that she was thrown out of Eden for refusing to be subservient to Adam. In fact, in the New Testament, Jesus regularly treated women as equals in ways that modern audiences don't realize would have been shocking and even alarming for the contemporaries of the authors who penned the books of the Bible. This indication of equality from the Son of God indicates that the Bible's Lilith couldn't possibly have been the first wife of Adam, and the creation of a God who clearly didn't see a difference between man and woman. Thus, the brief mention of Lilith in the Old Testament is likely a reference to Lilith being a demon, and though she was not well described in the text, she would not have needed to be, as every ancient reader of the Old Testament would have immediately recognized the Lilith figure. One of the first documented mentions of Lilith, though, comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2000 BC. This epic was the world's first known superhero story and tells the story of a mighty warrior named Gilgamesh, who performed many heroic deeds. In one part of the story, the hero helps the goddess of love and war cut down a tree in order to fashion a throne for herself. But as the wood is split open, they discover it's been inhabited by a trio of evil spirits: the serpent, the zoo bird, and the demoness Lilith herself. In an epic battle, Gilgamesh defeats the serpent and zoo bird, but only manages to force Lilith to flee into the desert, unable to overcome her. Sometime around 400 BC, Lilith once more appears in a major historical work, this time the famed Dead Sea Scrolls. These manuscripts were discovered in sealed-up caves along the Jordan River and predate many books of the Bible. Here, Lilith once more makes an appearance in a hymn, which is believed to be used for demonic exorcism. In this hymn, the reciter attempts to purge the victim of demonic corruption, naming Lilith by her name. The Talmud, one of the world's most ancient religious texts and written between the 6th and 3rd century BC, also mentions Lilith. Here she appears as a long-haired demon with wings who could seduce men and have sex with them in their sleep, often undetected. Ancient religious figures even went so far as to warn that men should not sleep alone so that Lilith would not visit and possibly slay them in their sleep. Leaving her mark across the ancient world, Lilith also appears in the form of countless charms and trinkets, all meant to ward off her nighttime attacks. A limestone plaque dating back to the 8th century BC is translated to read, "O you who fly in the darkened rooms, be off with you this instant, Lilith, thief and breaker of bones." These types of charms would often hang in the rooms of houses of pregnant women or newborn children, which were believed to be Lilith's favorite prey. Because she was seen as a sneaky predator, it was believed that if Lilith found the charm, she would flee the house, knowing that she'd been identified and possibly be discovered by its inhabitants. To this day, people claim that they're visited by nighttime demons, and despite modern explanations for sleep paralysis, some are not so satisfied that this phenomenon is purely natural. Many people still believe that succubus, female demons which prey on sleeping men, and incubus, male demons who do the same to women, are a very real phenomenon. Famously, a 1980s horror film called The Entity tells the allegedly true story of a woman who was prey to an incubus, a male night hag. Doris Bither was a single mother living in Culver City, California in 1978. She moved into a house but was warned by a Mexican neighbor that the house was evil and she should stay away from it. Plagued by personal problems, Doris experimented with a Ouija board and often used drugs and alcohol while trying to communicate with spirits. One night, Doris was physically attacked and raped by an unseen entity, and the attacks continued happening over the course of several months. Shockingly, they would even occur in front of her children, who would later testify to the veracity of their mother's claims. Stories about female and even male night hags have been with us for a millennia, and while science has a ready explanation for the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, it falls a little short when it comes to physical sexual assault by unseen beings. Yet, was Doris Bither's story purely fiction? And if so, why did all of her children claim to have seen some of these attacks, or even been on the receiving end of bites and scratches themselves? Is the night hag a real phenomenon, or is Lilith and her coterie of demons nothing more than our overactive, fearful imagination? Until science can definitely disprove the existence of paranormal forces, we'll leave it up to you to decide. Loudun, France, 1632. It's late at night when suddenly Jeanne awoke from a deep sleep to find a man standing over her mat. The mysterious stranger wept, begging her to pray with him. Fumbling in terror, she excused herself and fled, fetching another nun who saw nothing. But for the rest of the night, both of them were disturbed by mysterious whispers. Over the next several days, Jeanne began seeing the phantasm during the daytime. Sometimes he begged her to pray, sometimes he whispered lascivious things to her. Jeanne's skin crawled, it felt like her very bones itched. Soon, many of the nuns in the Ursuline convent of Loudun began experiencing similar symptoms. Blood raced through their veins, their hearts pounded, they hallucinated. Voices urged them to do wicked things. No matter how much penance and self-flagellation the nuns performed, the symptoms persisted. Their confessor thought they were possessed by demons. He began holding exorcisms, sprinkling the nuns with holy water and praying over them. The nuns cried out and mewed like cats. They writhed and contorted their bodies into sexual positions. By the authority of God, the priest demanded to know who had cursed the brides of Christ. The eyes of one of the nuns rolled back into her head and a deep voice emanated from her mouth. "Urban Grandier," answered the demon. Father Urban Grandier, the clergy, had been betrayed by one of their own. In 1617, Urban Grandier was appointed the parish priest of the church of Saint-Pierre-du-Marché in the small town of Loudun. He made a stir when he arrived at his post. He was good-looking, wealthy, and well-educated. Over the next few years, Grandier garnered quite a reputation. Despite the fact that priests were supposed to be celibate, he had secret affairs with several women of the town. Quick-witted and clever, Grandier was good at criticizing townspeople who disagreed with him. Some felt he was sympathetic to Huguenots, Protestant Christians who believed that simple devout faith was preferable in religious life than the lavish ceremonies of the Roman Catholics. There had been an ongoing power struggle between the religious sects for some time, and Grandier found himself in the middle of it. His sexual escapades and his political beliefs made him a lot of enemies and only added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, in 1626, near Loudun, the Ursuline convent was established. The convent quickly became a popular place to send noble daughters who couldn't be married off due to lack of money for a dowry or other reasons. One of the few joys of the austere lives of the Ursuline nuns was gossiping about townspeople, the most popular topic being Father Grandier. After the first prioress passed away in 1627, a new superior was appointed, Jeanne d'Ange. She had been sent to the convent because her hunchback and unattractive appearance made her marriage prospects poor. Ambitious Jeanne manipulated and lied her way into being appointed Mother Superior. Though the women ran the nunnery themselves, they still confessed to a male priest. Jeanne was apparently obsessed with Grandier and asked him to be the convent's chaplain. He declined the honor. In other accounts, Grandier wanted the position, but due to his behavior, he wasn't considered a suitable confessor for pure young brides of Christ. Either way, Father Mignon, who had a sterling reputation, was selected to be the confessor for the nuns of Ursuline. In 1630, some of Grandier's critics managed to bring charges against him for immorality. An enemy, the Bishop of Poitiers, found him guilty. However, due to his connections to high political figures, Grandier was restored to full clerical duties within the year. Not long afterwards, the Loudun region was struck by a typhus plague. The convent and other areas self-segregated to limit exposure to sickness. While the plague mainly subsided after about 6 months, anxiety, paranoia, and other mental health issues were rampant among the citizens. By this time, Jeanne had been prioress for about 5 years. She was in charge of 17 nuns with an average age of 25. For a long time, Genet had stewed over the fact that Father Grandier wasn't the confessor for the nunnery. She worked herself into hallucinations or lied and claimed she was experiencing hallucinations. Real or not, she confessed to Father Mignon about visions of Grandier tormenting her. Father Mignon and his assistant, Father Barre, were not fans of Grandier. They promptly turned this odd situation to their advantage. Later, some of the nuns were to claim that Father Mignon harassed and tricked them into being possessed. It's possible that the Bishop of Poitiers conspired with Father Mignon to get the nuns to claim that Father Grandier had bewitched them. The truth is lost to history. Symptoms spread throughout the nuns, and soon most of the nunnery was afflicted with possession. The nuns experienced everything from fits to beatings to invisible specters and hives. Curiously, some of the nuns seemed to suddenly speak foreign languages or displayed superhuman strength, and a host of other crazy symptoms. Father Mignon had been holding exorcisms at the convent. When prayed over or sprinkled with holy water, the nuns reacted, twisting their bodies into odd shapes, uttering blasphemies in deep voices, and crudely propositioning the priests in graphic sexual terms. When questioned, some of the nuns named the demons who had taken over their bodies. Others, especially Genet, claimed that Grandier had seduced them and that he was a magician practicing the dark arts. At first, Grandier was incredulous and laughed off the nuns' claims. It was a foolish miscalculation. The Witchcraft Act of 1604 called for the death penalty upon conviction of sorcery, witchcraft, and diabolical pact. The accusations of witchcraft persisted. Grandier began to take the issue seriously and mount a defense. He wrote the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who ended up sending his personal physician to examine the nuns. The doctor found no evidence of true possession. In March of 1633, the Archbishop ordered the exorcism ceased and the convent sequestered. The issue died down for several months, but later in the year the hysteria returned. Cardinal Richelieu, who held power both in the Catholic Church and as King Louis XIII's chief minister, got involved on behalf of the government. Previously, Richelieu and Grandier had clashed over Huguenots issues. In November 1633, Richelieu appointed a political crony of his, Jean de Loudun, as a leader of a commission to investigate if Grandier was a witch. As a precaution, Grandier was arrested and imprisoned in the castle of Algiers so he couldn't flee the area. The priests resumed exorcisms, but with a twist. Instead of being held at the convent, the exorcisms began being held publicly. In addition to Father Mignon and Father Barre, two other priests who specialized in exorcism, Father Tranquille and Father Lactance, joined the proceedings. Up to 7,000 spectators came to see the possessed nuns. Seeing the sexual acting out of the nuns turned public opinion against Grandier, and also many of the townspeople converted from Protestant to Catholicism as a result of the public executions. Meanwhile, the commission questioned Grandier, adding further accusations. They forced him to sign statements and denials, which were then taken by Loudun to the royal court in Paris. The commission also intercepted letters and petitions from Grandier's supporters. In May of 1634, Loudun returned to Loudun with a decree of the council, extending his powers and prohibiting Parliament and all other judges from interfering in the matter, as well as forbidding all parties concerned from appealing under penalty of a fine. In fact, several Grandier supporters chose to flee France because of the fear of the authorities denouncing them as accessory witches. During the trial, an alleged pact made between Grandier and the devil was brought to light. The pact, which confirmed Grandier's wicked duplicity, was said to be stolen from Lucifer's cabinet of devilish agreements by one of the tormenting demons. The agreement, allegedly written backward by Grandier in Latin and signed in blood, outlined Grandier's duty to the devil and the benefits he would receive in return. Co-signers were Satan, Beelzebub, Lucifer, Elemi, Leviathan, and Astaroth, and it was notarized by signature and mark of the chief devil and my lords, the princes of hell. Some nuns, including Genet d'Ange, began recanting their testimonies of possession, proclaiming Grandier's innocence. She even appeared in court with a noose around her neck, threatening to hang herself if they didn't let her recant her prior lies. Ultimately, 72 witnesses swore evidence against Grandier. Foregoing normal court procedures, the Royal Commission quickly passed a sentence on August 18, 1634. Urbain Grandier was found guilty of sorcery and placing evil spells to cause the possession of the Ursuline nuns. His punishment was to be burned alive at the stake. However, before his execution, Grandier was subjected to various tortures, including the boot, in order to force him to name his accomplices. Though they broke both his legs, Grandier refused to provide names. He apologized for his previous lascivious ways, but steadfastly maintained his innocence of witchcraft and any contracts with the devil. Often, the condemned were allowed to make a last statement to the crowd and were compassionately strangled before being burned at the stake. However, Grandier was not allowed this small mercy. Once he was on the scaffold, the friars deluged him with holy water, preventing him from speaking. Also, Friar Lactance lit the funeral pyre before the executioner could strangle Grandier, causing him to be burned alive. But Grandier had the last word. As he struggled against the flames, Grandier reportedly told Father Lactance that he would see God in 30 days. Grandier was correct. Father Lactance died within a month. In fact, Grandier's death seemed to unleash a curse upon several people involved with the trial. Within 5 years, Father Tranquille, one of the trial judges, Louis Chauvet, and Dr. Manoury, a fraudulent physician, fell into delirium and died insane. Father Barre eventually ended up being banished from the church for conspiring to accuse a priest of rape on the altar. Not long after Grandier's death, Father Jean-Joseph Surin came to London to perform exorcisms. Jeanne d'Ange had flip-flopped back and forth between being possessed and claiming that she lied. Father Surin attempted an exorcism for her and allegedly became possessed by Jeanne's devils. Haunted, he went into a slow decline, eventually becoming unable to eat, dress himself, walk, read, or write. He tried to commit suicide, but was taken in by the Jesuit college at Santa and was slowly nursed back to health. However, Jeanne d'Ange recovered from her malady. She ended up traveling France, displaying the curious physical sign from God that was proof of her exorcism and supernatural healing. The names of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and Francois de Sales miraculously and indelibly etched on her left hand. The exorcisms continued until 1637, 3 years after Grandier's death. They had become quite the tourist attraction. Twice a day, except on Sundays, the afflicted nuns were exorcised for the titillation of the crowds. Finally, Cardinal Richelieu cut off financial support and the shows ended. To his friends, Jason Dalton was always a friendly fella. Everyone said he'd never hurt a fly. He had no history of violence. He had no recorded mental issues. He was a married man with 2 kids who loved him dearly. And then one day, something snapped. A madman was on the loose, controlled no less by the devil himself. As crazy as it sounds, it's what Dalton said after he'd shot and killed people he'd never seen before in his life. In just about all cases involving serial or rampage killers, there are early signs that they'll lose the plot at some point. Nonetheless, on the outside, it didn't seem that Dalton had the markings of a maniac. In fact, his life looked like the picture of perfect middle America. Born on June 22, 1970, he grew up in a small rural community called Greenfield, not too far from Indianapolis. By all accounts, he had a regular childhood, replete with happy family gatherings and good relationships with his peers. He was never beaten at home and he wasn't bullied in school. He was a good student and even better at sports, competing on the school track team and the wrestling and football teams. In short, Dalton didn't seem to have any kind of childhood trauma that could explain his incredibly grievous actions later in life. After getting married, his wife worked in sales and pulled in about $40,000 a year, and he earned around $50,000 a year working in insurance, so combined, they weren't exactly short of cash. Although Dalton would later work as an Uber driver to earn some extra money. Importantly though, he had 2 big obsessions. Those were rather masculine cars and something that might go with such cars, guns. He loved his guns. Like any old good red-blooded American, this short, stocky man, still muscular from his wrestling days in school, spent much of his free time shooting his guns and working on his various car projects. His friends said his marriage seemed to be made in heaven. He was also extremely devoted to his 2 kids. And this was exactly how things were in 2016 when Dalton walked into a local gun shop and purchased a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The owner knew him and said the day he seemed in his usual good spirits. And then the devil got a hold of Jason Dalton. February 20th, 2016, a man named Matt Mellon ordered an Uber. The night before, he'd left his car at a buddy's house, so he wanted to go and pick it up. At precisely 4:21 p.m., the Uber arrived, with Dalton as the driver in a silver Chevrolet Equinox. Mellon sat in the front because Dalton's pet German Shepherd dog had taken the back seat. On the drive, Dalton got a call through his speaker, and Mellon listened in. He happily spoke to his child about dinner plans. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then something happened. Exactly what, we can't say, but it might have had something to do with a certain notice on his phone. Mellon later explained that's when he pretty much slammed the gas pedal. Then boom, we were off. It was pedal to the metal, probably 75 to 80 miles an hour down this road. I was bracing for impact, basically. Mellon screamed as Dalton swerved into oncoming traffic. He drove right through a median strip, through a stop sign, and then hit a Ford on the side. At this point, Mellon's heart was racing. He screamed at Dalton, "Please stop, you just hit someone." But his driver, not even looking to his side, seemed like a man possessed. Maybe he was. Finally, the maniac stopped. Mellon got out and without hesitation called 911. He looked up and saw the back of Dalton's head as the car raced away. Mellon could have had no idea how close he was to being shot. A little later, Dalton called his wife and asked her for the keys to his Hummer H3. She told him she'd taken him to his parents' place and would give him to him there. But before Dalton could get there, he received another notice on his Uber app, this time from someone wanting a ride from an apartment complex in Richland Township. He put his foot down as soon as he saw the message. We can have no idea what he was thinking at this point, but it seems he had murder in his mind. When he arrived at the complex, he stopped the car, opened the window, and talked to the woman named Tiana Carruthers. She later said, "February 20th is the day my whole life changed." She was with her young kids when Dalton screamed to a halt. He asked her if she was Macy, the person who'd made the call. She told him she wasn't. At first he drove off, but then for some reason he began to turn the car around. Slowly he drove back to Carruthers, his mean face staring right at her. As he got closer, he pointed his gun and shot her 4 times. She was in shock, barely feeling the bullets. As she fell to the ground, one of them dangerously lodged itself in her liver. Her quick thinking and decision to play dead probably saved her life. Thankfully, her children were unharmed. The person who made the Uber request then sent Dalton a message saying she'd made a mistake and the address had changed. At this point, he was driving like a lunatic and would likely have had a head-on collision had the driver of the other car not swerved out of the way. Dalton then hit another car after going through a red light. When he finally stopped, he messaged the person back, simply saying something had come up, explaining he couldn't make the pickup. After more hectic driving, he returned home. He told his wife he'd been hit and someone had shot at him. He looked at her like he'd never looked at her before and then told her to arm herself. He said it wasn't safe outdoors. He said she should keep the gun on her and not let the kids out of the house. "You'll see it on the news," he told her, without explaining what had happened. She was suspicious because he couldn't look her in the eye. He then told her to take the dog. He had to go out. Was the devil calling to him again? After his Hummer failed to start, he took the Chevrolet HHR, the car usually reserved for his wife. At 6:44 p.m., he got some money from an ATM. He then drove around for a while and returned home, this time to switch guns from a Glock to a Walther P99. For the next hour, he responded to his Uber requests and took people to their destinations. The passengers later said he drove at his normal speed, was friendly, and didn't look at all worried or panicked. Why he left those people alone is something of importance that we'll come back to later. The last pickup that went without incident was at 9:21 p.m. He took 3 people from the Fairfield Inn near a Cracker Barrel restaurant, which we'll soon return to the Kalamazoo Beer Exchange. All 3 passengers said their driver looked and drove fine. At this point, a loving husband and father named Richard Smith had arrived with a son at the Ford Kia dealership. The son Tyler wanted to show his pop a truck he had his eyes on. Sadly, this was to be their last day out together because Dalton had arrived at the showroom and he believed he was still on a mission from Satan. Dalton walked up to the 2 and asked them what cars they were interested in. He then just shot them down in a hail of bullets. Between them, the 2 Smiths were shot 18 times. In utter shock, Tyler's girlfriend, Alexis Cornish, ducked for cover while still in the car outside. Once Dalton was gone, she used her boyfriend's phone to call 911. The father and son died from their injuries at the scene. The Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety received a call saying shots fired at the Kia showroom. Police then raced to the scene just as investigators were taping off the previous crime scene at the apartment complex. When they arrived, they found Alexis hiding in the car and the 2 males already deceased. Alexis told police the culprit was a large white male with gray hair. As the officers were trying to figure out what had gone down, they got another call over the radio. Again, it said shots fired. 10 minutes had now passed since the Kia showroom shooting. It was 10:17 p.m. when Dalton walked up to a white van in the parking lot of that Cracker Barrel restaurant he'd been close to earlier. Sitting in the van was an elderly woman. Allegedly prompted by the devil, Dalton asked her something and then shot her. He turned to the car close by, occupied by 4 people. He shot 17 rounds into that vehicle. Approximately 6 minutes later, when Dalton was on the road again, a Michigan State Police trooper arrived at the parking lot to find the woman in the van already dead. 3 of the 4 people in the other car were also dead. One of them was Mary Lou, who died next to her sister-in-law Mary Jo, who also died. 2 of their friends, Dorothy Brown and Barbara Hawthorne, succumbed to their injuries too. All of them were in their 60s and 70s. Hawthorne was with a 14-year-old girl named Abigail Kopf. She was shot in the head but miraculously survived after numerous surgeries. Now, multiple police units were on the lookout for a man driving a Chevrolet HHR who they were pretty sure was behind all of the shootings. They were told over the radio that they were looking for an average-build male, tall, dark clothing, possibly blonde hair. The undersheriff told a reporter, "We've had several shootings here tonight in the county and city of Kalamazoo. They all appear to be related. We have multiple people dead. In summary, what it looks like we have is somebody just driving around, finding people and shooting them dead in their tracks." Meanwhile, Dalton was still using his app. At 12:04 a.m., he picked up 3 passengers and took them to a Western Michigan University dormitory. They later said the driver seemed completely normal to them, if not a bit unfriendly. As you'll see, it was good luck on their part that they weren't killed. 8 minutes later, he took 4 young passengers from Bell's Eccentric Cafe to the Radisson Hotel. One of them joked, "You're not the shooter, are you?" Dalton said no. Just under a few minutes later, during the next trip from Central City Tap House to Rutgers Up and Under, one of the 3 passengers again joked and asked him if he was the killer. Dalton replied, "Wow, that's crazy. No way, I'm not the guy." When he pulled up at Rutgers Up and Under, a police officer spotted the car and called for backup. At 12:40 a.m. it arrived, and in no time at all, Dalton was in handcuffs after putting up no fight at all. There was a reason for this. They found a gun and a ballistic vest in the car, and later, after watching surveillance tapes, they knew they had their man. While the analysis was being performed on Dalton's phone and at each crime scene, he sat with investigators in an interrogation room. What had happened to this seemingly normal family man? It seemed he had no motive for the crimes whatsoever. At first he didn't want to talk, but after a while he started chatting about his beloved German Shepherd. He also asked to speak to his wife, but soon hung up. He told the officers he just wanted to hear her voice. For a long time, the investigators were getting nowhere, but then Dalton surprised them all. He told them he'd been driving his Uber, and when he heard a beep on his phone, he looked at the app and saw the Eastern Star. He then explained, "I just tapped it, and there was like a devil head that popped up. It was some sort of like horned head, like a cow head or something. I pressed the button, and that's where all the problems went after that." He explained that when he tapped the devil's head, it told him he could drive as crazy as he wanted, and no harm would come to him at all. He could do what he wanted and say what he wanted, and there would be no repercussions. He then said that the Devil app had 2 modes, a red mode and a black mode. When it's in that black mode, he explained, it literally has control of you. It would do a little blink at me. It was then and there that he had to do exactly what the devil told him to do. He said if it dinged once, he had to complete an assignment, but if it dinged twice, then he didn't have to do anything. So he explained to the shocked cops that the reason he shot some people and didn't shoot others. He told them that the only reason he didn't start shooting when he was finally pulled over was the Devil app was in red mode. Dalton further explained, "I was no longer being guided. I mean, that's not my nature to be that way. The minute that app went from black to red, I had my presence." The officers, of course, had to try to understand whether Dalton really believed this or if he was just trying to act crazy. One of them said he really did look like he believed in what he was saying. It was like he was a puppet, he said. Dalton didn't show much remorse for what he'd done, although he did express some concern over shooting the young girl. Still, he seemed to be quite relaxed for a man who'd ruined numerous lives and was now looking at a long prison sentence. When police looked into his life, they found what we explained at the start. Dalton was a well-liked family man who was respected in his community. A couple of people talked about how he would fire his guns all the time and that he could go at times from placid to agitated, but other than that, there seemed to be no explanation for why he had gone on his rampage. He just kept telling the detective the same thing again and again, such as this: "The minute I logged on, to be honest with you, I don't know what happened. I know you guys are going to have a hard time believing this, but it literally took over my mind and body." It was then up to the courts to decide if he was crazy or not. Despite his talk of the devil, psychiatrists found him fit to stand trial. Still, police were stumped as to what had gone wrong, and they still are now. Dalton might have been a bit wary about burglars, but other than that, he didn't seem to have any pathological fears. He held no extreme views at all. He was a good father and husband who had just metamorphosed one evening into a brutally cruel killer. Even while awaiting trial, he seemed happy enough looking at his cell walls all day. One detective said, "He's very even-tempered. He's not upset about anything. He doesn't display any noticeable emotions." What the detective said sounded a bit like what had happened in the Michael Douglas movie Falling Down, in which Douglas lost his mind from the vicissitudes of daily life and went on a mad rampage. The detective admitted, "We're probably weeks away from finding out, but in the end, the final analysis might be, this was a guy who just cracked up." But there were signs later that Dalton was a very unstable man. At one point during the trial, one of the survivors, Tiana Carruthers, was giving her testimony. She could barely talk through her tears, and that's when Dalton showed some of his more unhinged side. Seemingly without any concern for his victim, he started rambling about black bags. He then shouted at her, take it," and though restrained, he tried to get up from his chair. She screamed hysterically, and that's when he was manhandled out of the courtroom. It's difficult to understand what he was trying to do, but let's just say the quiet family man at that moment looked like someone capable of killing, and perhaps even believing Satan talked to him through his Uber app. On February 5, 2019, after pleading guilty to all charges, Jason Dalton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was a wicked man in life, and so in death he became a wicked thing. He wandered the earth with an insatiable hunger, feasting when he could on dog feces and dead vermin. He was the starving ghost, and he remained that way for eternity. But did it have to be that way? We think not. For many of you watching this, ghosts may not be such a big deal. Sure, you've been scared watching a horror movie in the past, but you don't really believe ghosts are all around you. That's probably because you come from Western culture. But if you head over to parts of Asia, where we'll be going today, ghosts are no small deal. They really are all around people. people. Head over to any number of countries in Southeast Asia, and you'll see things called spirit houses outside just about every building, big or small. You can find them in front of luxurious hotels or government buildings, but you'll also see them next to tiny ramshackle houses or even bars where tourists would often ask why the locals are filling them with bottles of red Fanta and scraps of food. Tourists in Bangkok, for instance, sit on stools drinking beers and watching the madness of Bangkok's streets go by, and then think, what on earth is this person doing putting bottles of strawberry Fanta in that little house? The answer is they're making up an offering to the spirits. They're asking for protection, and this is not some small superstition taken up by only a few groups of people. It happens all over the country every single day. Thais, as well as other nationalities from that part of the world, take their spirits seriously. People sometimes even get uncomfortable when you just say the word P. That means ghost. Just recently, an article in the New York Times, a 47-year-old educated Thai man said, Thai people respect ghosts and spirits. Every day we pray, and you will notice our country has not had many cases of coronavirus. The spirits listen to our prayers. It's that serious. You do not mess with ghosts. By the way, not long after he said that, cases went through the roof. And those are good spirits. As you'll see today, there are some bad ones, and those guys can really mess up a nice afterlife. You might not believe in them, but you'll soon hear about people that claim to have seen them. In Thailand, as well as other countries such as India, Sri Lanka, China, Cambodia, Tibet, Laos, Vietnam, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and Malaysia, you'll hear about PRET, the ghost no one wants to become. Being PRET is tough. It means wandering around in a kind of purgatory and you're always starving. The compulsion is as bad as having constant opiate withdrawals. How PRET is defined depends on the culture, but it's always the hungry ghost or the starving ghost. Can never be content. They have this insatiable hunger, but their mouths are as small as needles. They're often depicted as having big bellies and having tongues that reach down to their legs. Sometimes all they can eat is the feces of animals or even humans, and in that wasteland where they live, they see rivers oozing with blood and pus, where scabs and broken teeth fill the water. Everything around them is dead or decaying or dying. It is agony on earth, or someplace between earth and being born again. In the sense of rebirth, becoming a PRET means you've accumulated a lot of bad karma in your life. So if you're greedy, materialistic, stingy, a cheat, or just a bad person in general, becoming a PRET could be your fate. And as we said, this is not something to be balked at. Many people from those regions watching the show might have been told as kids that if they don't shape up and start doing the right thing, they could end up walking the earth as a PRET. The closest thing to PRET in Western culture might be a figure you all know as Gollum from the Lord of the Rings books. If you think about it, a wandering being who is tormented by his need for his precious is just like a PRET. Like Gollum, the PRET is not necessarily seen as dangerous. PRETs are to be pitied. They're awful, monstrous things who actually just need your help. That's why some living people sometimes ceremonially offer gifts to PRET in the hope that the soul that's stuck in that terrible state can be released. We're not sure just how long they've been around, but we know they go back centuries. There's something called the Scroll of Hungry Ghosts from Japan that dates back to the 12th century. It depicts the hungry ghosts feeding on what is being pooped out by living people. It sucks to be a PRET. The question is, how many folks have actually seen them? Do they really visit you in your sleep? In 2012, a nun at Wat Khao Khao in Thailand was praying when she said she saw a PRET. It made the news in Thailand, and it scared the hell out of people. The nun, 58-year-old Mei Chi Pao An Man, said she'd been practicing the Buddhist religion at a temple for a decade and had never seen anything out of the ordinary. One day, her life changed. Translated from Thai, the news said she was practicing meditation at the prayer hall when she suddenly felt something beside her. Turning around, she saw a strange figure standing there. It was very tall and boneless. She said she prayed for it and suddenly it ran down a hall. She followed only for it to turn into a bird and fly away. But get this, when she told local villagers what she'd seen, they too said there had been sightings of the PRET. Some had even reported it to the police, and when the policeman also saw it, the Thai news said it scattered. Maybe you don't believe the story. Maybe you think the folks in this little village in Thailand's Ang Thong province are drunk on superstition. But we found more tales of sightings. There was the 2021 story of a 12-year-old boy named Tana Chot in the Prachinburi province of Thailand, who according to the Thai news media had some shocking information. In March, he said he was tinkering with a motorcycle outside his house when he heard the dog howl. He didn't think much of it, but then he heard a whistling sound. He said he got up to look around, and when he caught sight of what he described as a tall and skinny figure more than 20 meters high, like a coconut tree. It also said it had big hands. Some villagers believed him, some didn't. Mrs. Pu Phim Suan, the village head, said she didn't believe this kid had seen the devil. Nonetheless, with the child in shock, she thought someone might have played a trick on him. The top comment on the YouTube video posted by the Thai media company included this: "My grandmother practiced the Dharma. She has seen it and it really exists. He came to find someone who can send merit to him. Remember, the PRET can be released from its agony if enough people make merit for it. Other people in the comments said the same thing. Some were a little skeptical, but most weren't. One guy said he'd seen one himself. Then there's the story of the temple in Bangkok called Wat Saket. In the 19th century, this place was used to cremate a large number of people, but after a cholera outbreak in 1820, there were so many deaths that they had to leave some of the bodies outside the temple grounds. That's when the vultures came, and people started talking about the vultures of Wat Saket. You can imagine, with all those dead bodies hanging about and vultures pecking out their eyes, people became a bit scared of this place. Not only was the sight an ugly one, but what happened to all the souls who'd been bad in life? They became PRET, of course, so this temple was said to be home to an overabundance of those monsters. The PRET also appeared at another temple called Wat Sutat. Wat actually just means temple in Thai. Writing about the PRET at this temple, someone said, "PRET is a human being who commits the ultimate sin. When he dies, he will be born as a devil to pay for his karma. He has a needle hole for a mouth and hands as big as a palm leaf. They appear at night." There seems to be much more talk of PRET in Thailand than in other Asian nations. Nonetheless, we saw a headline of an article written in 2011 by the Philippine Star. It said, "Banish hungry ghosts from your home." Here is some advice it gave. During the month of the Hungry Ghost, it is prudent to be extra careful when you're out at night. Take extra care when you drive, walk in busy streets, or travel. It's advised to purify their houses with incense, adding burn the incense and walk around in a clockwise direction in the house from room to room and door to door. Let the fragrance spread in the air. Open all windows and doors to let the bad energy move out. If that doesn't work, the writer of the story said wearing an amulet can help. If the worst happens and the PRET is nearby, you can start chanting hum 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 hum. It wasn't a joke article. We found other stories giving people advice on how to deal with PRET. In Vietnam, some people believe the 7th lunar month of the year will be the time the gates of hell are opened. This is when PRET and a whole host of other ghosts come to town. Hardcore believers, of which there are many, will not even go out at night during the month of the Hungry Ghosts. Some will turn vegan while others will make sure they merit many times over. One Vietnamese website also gave this priceless advice. Don't remove your leg hair. Spirits tend to avoid people with more leg hair. Don't swim in the water, as spirits might grab your legs. Don't hang clothes out at night, as the spirits might be attracted to it. Don't turn your head if someone follows or calls your name from behind at night. A guy writing in English said they were in Singapore when they saw an altar with Yakult, toys, and biscuits on it. At first they wondered why, then they realized it was the month of the Hungry Ghost. He said that day he had a dream and in it 2 kids asked him for help. He said he couldn't help them. After seeing the altar and remembering the dream, he got in an elevator. He wrote, "As the lift began its ascent, 2 ghostly faces stared at me through a reflection on the glass. They looked normal except for one thing, they had no legs. When I arrived home, they stopped at the door. They couldn't enter because I had a feng shui mirror." The spirits asked to come inside and they said they needed help, but they drifted away when he said he couldn't help. The guy concluded, "Until today, I avoided breaking any 7-month superstitions, just in case." Over in Malaysia, the media has run similar stories, stressing that elders tell youngsters they should not stay out at night during the Hungry Ghost month. One of the articles was picked up by CNN, who said this happened during the month of the Hungry Ghost. Sightings of a headless ghost at a Malaysian high school are scaring students away from attending classes. The chairman for state education said there was nothing to worry about, telling the media, "I've not heard of anyone being injured from being mauled by ghosts, and it's safe for children to go to school." Still, most people would not think such a story was so plainly ridiculous that he didn't have to make such a statement. Not in Asia, where the force of PRET is strong. Some people believe there are 3 kinds of PRET. For one type, anything they try and eat will burst into flames as soon as they get the food close to their mouths. The type 2 have needle mouths, and the third type have mouths so decomposed nothing can get in there. When asked to describe just what kind of person will become a PRET, one scholar explained, "We've seen how people can wrap their whole lives around graspiness and neediness, and every time they meet with somebody, it's like you can hear the suction. You can just hear it. You feel like the blood is coming out of your pores. And that's the kind of person you instinctively stay away from because literally you can feel your energy being sucked into them." From the ancient Indian text called the Vedas, there's a story of the origin of the PRET. It goes like this. A man known as the Pretender robs the clothes of a mother and her 5-year-old son. He then sees the boy drinking water from a jar, and since water is scarce, the man takes that too. In short, the boy dies and the mother dies from grief. In translation, the text reads, "By that sin I became a ghost with a mouth as small as the hole of a needle and the body as huge as a mountain. Although I get food, I cannot eat. Although I burn with hunger, my mouth is contracted. Since in my mouth I have a hole equal to that of a needle, I am known as Sukimuka." We found a definition of the word that read, Sukimuka, needle face, an ever-suspicious man that is always wary of people trying to grab his wealth. Proud of his money, he sins to gain and retain it. A person writing about the Indian mythology said perhaps the PRET, or PRETA as it's sometimes called, is actually a person in real life. Think about it. If you are a greedy person who can never be content with what you have, you'll be in pain. If your life is all about consumption but you can't ever be fulfilled, is that not going to cause you eternal sadness? A kind of living agony? A wise man once said, the things you own end up owning you. Perhaps he looked into a mirror one day and seen a PRET staring back at him. A boy, his face ashen and distorted, violently writhes on the bed. With incomprehensible strength, he breaks out of his binds. In a guttural, evil voice, he growls something incoherent. The priest holds up a cross, momentarily repulsing the boy. "The power of Christ compels you," shouts the priest. The boy growls back, his black teeth gnashing between his snarled lips. "The power of Christ compels you!" That priest is about to get hurt. He doesn't fully know what he's up against, but this, he thinks, has got to be the work of the devil. And if that opening scene sounds a bit like a movie you once watched, perhaps one featuring a girl with a screw-top head who doesn't mind using rather colorful language, it's because the exorcism we're talking about today served as the basis of that movie. Yeah, we mean The Exorcist. The makers of The Exorcist didn't pull the plot out of a hat. It was actually very closely based on the exorcism we're featuring today. In the real version, the priest really did get hurt. That boy did things the little boy should not be able to do. But we'll come back to the actual exorcism later. First of all, we won't blame some of you more scientifically minded folks for saying there's just no way anyone could be possessed by the devil. The majority of the world, we would assume, thinks such a thing as demonic possession making little boys go mad is a made-up story created by folks who've allowed the idea of Satan to get in their heads. That's a good thing. Amen. After all, we used to burn witches on this planet, something that is a disgrace to humanity in modern times. So first of all, let's have a look at the people behind the exorcism. Were they, as the British might say, completely off their trolley? Stark raving mad? Deranged, fanatical nut jobs who liked bullying children with mental health issues? You probably already know that exorcisms are a real thing and can be performed provided the exorcist gets the green light from the church. According to news reports, the number of exorcisms in the USA has been on the increase as of late. In 2018, the BBC reported that the Vatican has invited 250 priests from all over the world to attend an exorcist training course. We kid you not. In 2020, the Associated Press called exorcisms commonplace. We're telling you this just so you understand that exorcisms are taken seriously by the church and aren't just something undertaken by lunatics suffering from meth psychosis. So when we tell you that a priest named Walter Halloran was there for the exorcisms in today's show, you can bet he was a real priest who earnestly wanted to rid the boy of the devil. There were a bunch of priests who saw that young boy do some incredible things, but not too many of them have talked in depth about it. The church was pretty hush-hush about the matter, with Halloran once saying, "I can't go on record. I never made an absolute statement about the things because I just didn't feel I was qualified." The priest, Raymond J. Bishop, was also there and he took notes. This is how we know what happened during those exorcisms, of which there were quite a few. When the devil squats in someone's head, he usually hunkers down. It was Bishop, a great name for a priest by the way, that really went into detail. He said 14 priests attended the exorcisms in total, and all of them were somewhat surprised by what they saw, with some also being skeptical. We'll come back to the skepticism. Okay, so in 1949, in the middle-class neighborhood of Belle Noire of St. Louis, Missouri, a 13-year-old kid living in a grand colonial-era house on Roanoke Drive decided he wanted to play around with a Ouija board. Once, this kid was talked about for his dealings with the devil in subsequent meetings with those priests. The press called him Ronald Doe or Robbie Mannheim, but his real name was Roland Hunkeler. The family was German-American. Young Roland was devastated after hearing that his beloved Aunt Harriet had passed away from complications of her multiple sclerosis. She was the one who taught him how to use the Ouija board. She was apparently a bit of a spiritualist. Not long before she kicked the bucket, the boy started hearing and seeing strange things around the house. According to the diaries of one of the priests, both the kid and his grandma started hearing a dripping sound, although there was no source of water. The date was January 15th. That same day, the boy started hearing scratching noises, again with seemingly no source. They seemed to be coming from somewhere under the floorboards. You could blame mice for that, but not for a shaking picture of Jesus Christ that was hung on the wall. This went on for 10 days, after which there were 3 days of silence, according to what the priest wrote. Then, the boy said for another 3 days every night he heard the sound of squeaking shoes on his own bed. January 26th was the day his aunt passed, and that's when things started to get really crazy. The sounds around the house got worse, and now the boy thought it must be his dead aunt. He, along with his mom and grandma, got out the Ouija board and tried to make contact with the aunt. The mom asked, "If you are Tilly, knock 3 times." A gush of air then hit all of them and 3 bangs came from under the floorboards. The mom then said, "If you are Tilly, tell me positively by knocking 4 times." 4 knocks were heard by all the party. They then heard a scratching sound on the blanket on the nearby bed, Roland's bed. These strange goings-on kept happening, and so on February 17th, Roland went to stay at the parsonage where Minister Reverend Schultz lived. He wanted to see if anything strange happened around young Roland. So far, when weird things did happen, he was always close to the source. His mom thought the spirit of his aunt, or possibly something worse, was inside of him. That night at the minister's house, some strange things indeed happened. Schultz said he also heard scratching sounds close to Roland, along with hearing vibrations coming from the bed. A chair, said the minister, also tipped over. February 26th was the day things really kicked off. Not only were the scratching sounds heard, but actual scratches appeared on Roland's body. Sure, he could have done this by himself, but the diary states that the mom was there when some of those scratches happened, as if by magic. She said it looked as though they'd been done by claws. This was in the diary anyway. It's a pity she wasn't around when the story became well known after the making of The Exorcist. She went to see Father Albert Hughes of St. James Catholic Church in Mount Rainier, who told her to pray and bless the house with holy water and blessed candles. But that didn't seem to help matters. The diary states that when the mom had just lit some candles, a comb flew across the room and knocked them over. The mom and Roland started seeing all sorts of unexplainable things. At one point, some fruit flew across the room. Another time, a kitchen table just flipped. One day, Roland was sitting in a chair and it turned around by itself. Then a coat took a trip across the room and a Bible ended up at Roland's feet. Was this a case of collective hysteria? Was Roland somehow furtively making all these things happen? Even the school sent him home more than one time because the teacher said his desk started spinning around. Remember, this was all in the diary, so you have to take the priest's word for it. Mrs. Doe didn't question that something out of this world was going on. She saw things for herself. One day she was filling a bottle with holy water and it flew across the room. Somehow it didn't smash. A bit later, she was lighting a candle next to Roland's bed when the bed moved with her and him on it. The mom did what any ultra-pious person would do and took her son to be baptized again. Only during the process, Roland went absolutely mad. She then sent him to stay with relatives, and according to the diary, scratch marks and what the diary called brandings appeared on the boy's body. At one point, Roland had a 3-day stay at Georgetown University Hospital. This is where the first of the exorcisms happened, and the priest who performed it was Father Hughes. He would later relay what happened to other priests. As per the start of this video, the boy slipped out of his binds. He then ripped a spring out of the mattress and used it to cut the priest's arm. Due to this injury, the exorcism was aborted. After that, Hughes kept mostly quiet about the matter and secluded himself from society for a fair few years. It was later said that the event caused him a considerable amount of trauma. On March 9th, Father Bishop saw the seemingly possessed boy for the first time. He too said he saw the mattress moving by itself and young Roland looking worse for wear. 2 days later, both he and another priest, Father Bodern, visited the house again. This time they both said prayers above Roland's bed and blessed him with a religious relic stated as a piece of bone from the forearm of St. Francis Xavier. Relatives of Roland were also in attendance. In all, it said 49 people witnessed the possession of Roland Doe. After leaving a special crucifix under Roland's bed, the priests took off. A few hours later, banging could be heard from his room. When the relatives opened the door, the sight that greeted them was an overturned bench, a moved bookcase, and that crucifix was on the other side of the room. The mattress was shaking at this point, with Roland screaming, "Aunt Tilly, stop! Please stop!" A few days later, the 2 priests performed the ritual prayers of exorcism over Roland, but it seems that wasn't good enough. According to the diaries, Roland was moved around a lot. And now, with permission from Archbishop Joseph E. Ritter, other priests performed the rites of exorcism. Some rituals happened in Alexian Brothers Hospital in South St. Louis and others at various houses of relatives. Priests would stand above Roland's bed and usually recite the words, "I cast thee out, thou unclean spirit," along with the least encroachment of the wicked enemy and every phantom and diabolical legion. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, depart and vanish from this creature of God. The diaries state that during some of the rituals, Roland would writhe around as usual like a beast. Scratches appeared on his body. He would often curse at the priests, a la the Exorcist girl, and he'd sometimes spit, vomit, and pee in the bed. He'd also use Latin, even though Roland on his better days couldn't speak Latin. If you think this story can't get any more unbelievable, the diary said during one of the rituals, a picture in the form of scratches appeared on Roland's calf. It was described as the devil with webs stretching from his arms. During other exorcisms, it said a pitchfork would snake down Roland's leg. The priests also said at times an X would appear on his chest. Roland was later taken to another town by train. Father Bowden was his caretaker during the journey, who, it said, was whacked in the balls by Roland out of the blue. The father said Roland laughed and said to him, "That's a nutcracker for you, isn't it?" April 18, 1949, the night of the last exorcism, in attendance were relatives who watched Father Bowden perform the ritual. On this occasion, the father tried to ascertain who it was inside the boy. The diary says Roland said he was one of the fallen angels. The priest shouted back, "Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael. I command you, Satan, and the other evil spirits to leave this body, in the name of Dominus, immediately. Now, now, now." Suddenly, after one violent spasm, Roland just slumped on the bed in a heap. Then, as if coming out of a dream, he looked at the priest and feebly uttered the words, "He is gone." Roland later explained that at the moment of Satan leaving his body, he had a vision of Saint Michael wielding a fiery sword and vanquishing the devil. But had Satan gone? Was he ever even there? The thing with this case is for many years it remained a secret. In 1949, the Washington Post talked about an exorcism, but there were very few details, not even a name for the victim or the priests. It wasn't until the 1970s that the news picked it up again and started giving the story more details. One of the stories said, the only physical remains of the exorcism in Mount Rainier are the steps and wall surrounding the house where the boy lived. The house burned down years ago and the lot is vacant. This was not true. Many things the media said about the case weren't true, which is why investigations into the matter took place later. Then, in 1985, the Washington Post wrote a story titled "Youth's Bizarre Symptoms Led to 1949 Exorcism." Later in 1993, "Possessed: The True Story of an Exorcism" was published. Everything was then brought into question. Sure, there was a boy who might have looked to have been possessed at times, but the authors of the investigation said people had joined up a lot of dots after hearing stories. Father Halloran had indeed been there during some of the exorcisms, and he did say he saw scratches, but he also noted that those scratches appeared when he wasn't looking. He told the press the words evil and hell formed on Roland's body. He also said he saw the mattress move, and at one point Roland flew at him and broke his nose. That was all true. But was Roland just an out-of-control maniac kid who likely in his adult years went on to graduate from pretending to be possessed to committing serious crimes or being locked up in an institution where the walls are soft and they feed you buckets of Valium with your breakfast? In 2004, Father Halloran passed away. He was the last of the priests who attended those exorcisms. In one of his last interviews, he said Roland had gone to live a rather ordinary life. Maybe the boy was just mentally unhinged and enjoyed getting off of school. As for Father Hughes, the investigators couldn't find any proof that he had attended an exorcism and after had a nervous breakdown, nor could they find anything that showed the kid had been taken to the hospitals we mentioned. As for those secret diaries, they were real enough, but the priest much of the time relayed what he'd only heard. He might also have made some things up. We'll never know because they all died once the story got some legs. Sure, the priests and the parents might have seen scratches and things flying around, but skeptics think Roland was a clever little devil and managed to orchestrate everything. Why priests would believe this was demonic possession was explained by one of the many skeptics. He said, to psychiatrists, Rob Doe suffered from mental illness. To priests, this was a case of demonic possession. To writers and film and video producers, this was a great story to exploit for profit. Those involved saw what they were trained to see. The only person who could maybe explain the truth of what really went down is Roland himself, who, if he is still alive, will now be creeping toward the age of 90. Let's hope when we say, "Is there anybody there? Is there anybody there?" old Roland might leave us a comment below this video. It's early in the morning when the sound of his beeper awakens a Fall River detective. It's a body, he's told, a murder. What he doesn't know is that the crime scene he's about to see will strike fear into the hearts of all Americans. There are Satanists among us, people will hear from their TVs. No one is safe. The victim was named Doreen Ann Levesque. Abandoned from a young age, she had the worst kind of childhood and later found herself doing sex for work. She was brutally murdered on October 13, 1979. Her body was found under the bleachers at the Diamond Vocational High School. The two joggers that made the grisly discovery could hardly believe their eyes. She'd been tied up and viciously beaten, her face barely recognizable as the girl she'd been. Notably, to some, the murder had a ritual element to it. It wouldn't be long until people started to whisper the word Satanist, but as you'll see, people can get carried away, especially when they've grown up hearing dark tales about the devil. As city names go, Fall River sounds pretty, but to be frank, this wasn't a pretty place back then. Once a fairly prosperous textile town, Fall River in the late 70s and 80s had fallen on hard times. That was evident when you walked down some of the streets and witnessed the many drunks, the drug addicts, and prostitutes prostitutes trying to eke out a living in some very harsh conditions. Levesque was one of the many young girls who'd ended up on the wrong part of town. On some nights, there were so many prostitutes and prospective Johns that it caused traffic jams. Still, while the place was run down somewhat, the murder shocked everyone, the sheer brutality of it. The next victim was 19-year-old Barbara Raposa. She was reported missing in November, but her body wasn't found until January 26, 1980. Like the first victim, she'd been bound and hit over the head and the face with a heavy object. Also, like the first victim, she'd been a victim herself of the travails of a difficult life. Like Levesque, she was known to frequent bars in some of the rougher parts of town, and she was said to have a drug habit. To make ends meet, she also got involved with sex work. So there were two young female victims. Both had been brutally killed after being tied up. These murders, it seemed, were not crimes of passion. The modus operandi in the killings pointed towards a possible serial killer. It also looked as though Levesque's body had been moved in a specific way, something that the police called posing. This sometimes happens in an attempt to hide something from police or because the act of posing gratifies the killer. But cops at the time were looking for perhaps something bigger than a lone serial killer. They had reason to believe Satanists were in their midst. They'd heard rumors about such people. On February 8, 1980, the same police were talking to a 20-year-old sex worker named Karen Marsden. It goes without saying that in a small city such as Fall River, if you worked on the streets, then you knew the other sex workers. Marsden was with cops that evening in a state of terror. She was rambling and at times making no sense, although she seemed to suggest that she knew something about the satanic rituals that had been going on, usually out in a place called Freetown State Forest. Police asked her who headed this murderous cult, but the only name she'd give them was Satan. She didn't actually mean Satan himself, but some evil person who'd been given the name Satan. She told cops that if she actually told them who this Satan person was, she'd be dead in no time. She refused to believe that the authorities could protect her. Marsden then told the police to drop her off at St. Mary's Church. She was so shaken up, she said she wanted to talk to a priest. The next day, she was reported missing by her grandmother. She wasn't seen again, alive at least. A couple of months later, her skull with some teeth attached as well as clumps of her hair was found in a nearby forest. Her body was nowhere to be seen. Now we'll introduce you to another important person in this story. She is Robin Marie Murphy, who was 17 when police started talking to her. Murphy was yet again another victim in the story, a girl who had suffered at the hands of men since she was just young. This trauma led her to a life of darkness, and at some point she ended up working as a pimp on the mean streets of Fall River. It's there that she got to know the murder victims. Like the other folks in the tale, she can often be found around the housing projects in the city called Harbor Terrace. On any given night there, you could score a gram of whatever, hear the screams and arguments of drunks, and watch the sex workers head toward their place of choice, Bedford Street. Strangely, the hub of criminal activity was just around the corner from police headquarters, but the cops didn't seem to interrupt the various transactions that took place there on a nightly basis. They did, however, often visit their informants. One of them became Murphy. Murphy, according to those who knew her back then, was a fearsome character. She might have been smaller in size than many of the male hoodlums, but she was said to have little fear of them. One of the males she might have had reason to fear was a pimp and a so-called competitor. His name was Carl Drew, and he was 26 years old when this was all going on. Now we have all but one of the main pieces in place. We can tell you how the cops began to solve the crimes. Well, how they thought they solved the crimes. You'll soon agree that they could have gotten many things wrong. So there were two pimps on the streets, one man and another a woman. Police believed that Drew ruled the streets for the most part. They said he was one mean man, and he led his territory by putting the fear of God in people. Well, we should say the fear of Satan, because cops believed that he was this Satan character. They often thought that Drew used satanic rituals to scare people. That body found under the bleachers was his work, and the reason he could get away with it was his control over people. The police believed that it was Drew who killed Marsden too, because she had known about his earlier murder. One story had it that Levesque was killed because she wouldn't work for Drew. It didn't help Drew's case, a man that couldn't read or write and had a hard-knock life himself, that Murphy said he was indeed Satan and the leader of the rituals. She also said that Marsden had told her that she'd been forced to watch Drew kill Levesque. Marsden and Murphy had certainly been close. It seems they'd become lovers at one point, and so if anyone knew Marsden's closest secrets, it would have been her. Murphy agreed to testify against Drew. She told detectives that he'd killed Marsden because of the threat she was going to talk to the cops. She said Drew often had satanic rituals out in the forest where he sacrificed animals on an altar in the name of Satan. Murphy said on the night that Marsden was killed, Drew had forced her to cut her throat, after which they decapitated Marsden and even played around with her head. This sounded utterly crazy, which among other things created what is called a satanic panic panic. All over the US at the time, there was talk about satanic ritual abuse. These so-called followers of Satan did terrible things to their victims to propitiate their devil leader. The very talk of such rituals sent shockwaves through the US. But let's remember, such talk also sold newspapers and had people glued to their TV screens. The witch hunts, you should recall, were also keenly followed a few hundred years earlier in Europe. There were 8 churches in Fall River, so talk about God and the devil and the destruction the latter wreaks on mankind was not out of the ordinary. Strange beliefs even today are held in what's called the US's Bible Belt, so buying into stories of satanic rituals was not too strange back in the 1980s. What's of importance here, though, is out of all the thousands of rumors of satanic ritualism happening, there's never been much proof they actually happened, if any proof at all. Much of the panic started because of a book called Michelle Remembers. The book featured a woman who, through hypnotism, could recall moments in her life which Satanists had ritually abused her. That book has now been widely discredited. A satanic cult murdering people in Fall River got a lot of airtime, and many people believed the stories, but besides the words of a few people, there was absolutely no evidence they happened. Still, the newspapers back then wrote that Drew was accused of threatening his girls with satanic violence if they ever got out of hand. Prosecutors explained to the court that Drew had told people that he was the son of Satan. The court heard that Murphy had been possessed by Drew when she committed those terribly violent acts. The prosecutor asked her, "And what did you do?" Murphy answered, "Cut her throat." She also said that Drew had cut off one of Marston's fingers and taken a ring from it. Another young woman testified that one night Drew had given it to her in a bar. It didn't help his case that when Murphy was testifying, she wore a cross around her neck. The prosecution had done a good job at pitting the devil against a God-fearing victim. So when Murphy said Drew carved an X into the victim's body, the court almost shook with fear. When she said that Drew had spoken in an unknown language when doing the sacrifice, the palpable fear almost had people wanting to run out of the door. Murphy said he'd often speak in his foreign tongue when conducting other rituals that didn't involve murder. She said she'd attended around 10 of them from October 1979 to February 1980. The killing of Doreen Levesque was an offering of the soul of Satan, and so was the killing of Miss Marston, she told the court. We should state something very important here. There was no physical evidence whatsoever that put Drew at any of those crime scenes. Nothing. Zilch. He was a man that couldn't read or write, that later said he thought the justice system could never send an innocent man to prison. And guess what? Murphy had been lying, and we mean telling very tall tales indeed. She later said that she'd been coerced by prosecutors into fingering Drew for the crime. As for the satanic stuff, she said she'd also been pushed to talk about that. She'd been told she'd get no more than 12 years for a second-degree murder conviction, which, as you'll see, didn't happen. She later said she did believe that Drew had committed the first murder. She didn't know it for a fact, but she was convinced enough to let him go down for the other murder. As we said, she was a victim herself. She'd suffered at the hands of a man named Andy Malte, someone who had committed heinous crimes against young women in the area. We won't go into details, but he was a pervert to the extreme, a wicked man if there ever was one. During the murder investigations, he'd been talking to cops, apparently trying to offer some help. Here was a man with a history of violence against young women, a man who was known to keep tools in his car to commit such violence, and he was trying to help the police. He told the police that he thought he knew what happened to the last victim, Miss Raposa. He said he'd had a vision in a dream in which he saw her being killed. Here is some of the transcript when he was interviewed by the police. Police. What was in his hand? A knife, a gun? Malte. 2 hands in the air, something holding in between. Police. Knife or a gun? Malte. From what I could see, it looked like a rock. Police later took him to the scene of the crime, and Malte knew exactly where the body had been found and which direction it had been pointed in. He even told the police, "I sense a murder weapon here. It might have been a piece of concrete." He was right about that. He knew too much. Police didn't think that Malte had some kind of psychic ability, and instead, they charged him with the murder. Murphy later testified in court again, this time saying she'd actually been with Malte at the time of the murder. Years later, she admitted to making that up too as retribution for the things he'd done to her. To recap, Murphy said she took part in one murder and then later said she totally lied about that. She'd also said she'd been with Malte on the night of another murder, but she'd lied about that too. At least one other victim would later come forward and say Malte had done horrible things to her, but she'd been ignored by local police when she made the complaint. We now have another man in prison serving time for the Marston murder. Drew was convicted of that and sentenced to life without parole. While police tried to say he killed her because she could talk about the Levesque murder, Drew was never convicted of that crime for lack of evidence. The connection was still used against him though. Not too long ago, some documentary filmmakers started investigating this dark tale. They looked into that ring that Drew had apparently given to the woman after taking it from Marston's hands. The woman told the documentary makers that there had been no ring, that she'd made that story up. The reason, she said, was cops threatened her with prison for another crime if she didn't testify to that story. If this couldn't get more confusing, another woman said she was there for the Marston murder, and she said it didn't take place in the forest. She said she saw Murphy committing the murder on a rooftop. The documentary maker said this in an interview: "You could literally just go into the Fall River Superior Court and read the trial transcripts, 11 volumes. No one that reads these trial transcripts will come away thinking Carl Drew was guilty, despite what the jury said. In fact, hardly anyone who has studied the case with new eyes thinks that Drew had anything to do with the murders. He might have been a violent and unethical man, a trafficker of vulnerable young women, but that doesn't mean he should be serving that long sentence if he's innocent of the murders. Some people think that it was Malte who was likely behind all the murders. He was certainly a sexual deviant, and the more you know about him, you could be convinced he was capable of serial killing. He died in prison many years ago, so no one can speak to him again. He once told the police, 'Once I worshipped Satan, but now I worship Jesus.' We doubt he ever really worshipped anyone. He was a ruthless criminal, and there is nothing especially occult about hurting young people. It seems beyond doubt that no crimes in Fall River back then took place because of any belief in Satan. There's enough evil in the story to fill a book, but no devil pulled the strings. There are a lot of victims, but it seems there's no overarching dark power involved except all the jagged pieces that fit into place to condemn some people to a life of misery. One of those victims could be Drew, who might well be the victim of the justice system. He later said, 'I was thrown into the middle of a mass nightmare that involved macabre accusations of devil worship and human sacrifice, totally off-the-wall accusations that were right out of some thriller novel. None true as far as I was involved, and nothing like that was being said.' As you watch this, the Massachusetts Innocence Program is still trying to get him a new trial, but since his appeals have been exhausted, it might mean some new evidence needs to come to light if he's ever to get out of prison. Murphy had been released on parole after her second-degree murder charge based on the lies she'd told, but she didn't adhere to the conditions of her parole and was sent back to prison. Now she'll have a new hearing. Now you need to watch arguably an even stranger murder story, brutal true story of what they didn't tell you about the Burger Chef massacre. Or have a look at this.